Catherine and Her Destiny, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Long ago there lived a rich merchant who, beside possessing more treasures than any king in the world, had in his great hall 3 chairs, one of silver, one of gold, and one of diamonds. But his greatest treasure of all was his only daughter, who was called Catherine. One day Catherine was sitting in her own room, when suddenly the door flew open, and in came a tall and beautiful woman, holding in her hands a little wheel. "Catherine," she said, going up to the girl, "which would you rather have, a happy youth or a happy old age?" Catherine was so taken by surprise that she did not know what to answer, and the lady repeated again, "Which would you rather have, a happy youth or a happy old age?" Then Catherine thought to herself, "If I say a happy youth, then I shall have to suffer all the rest of my life. No, I would bear trouble now and have something better to look forward to." So she looked up and replied, "Give me a happy old age." "So be it," said the lady, and turned her wheel as she spoke, vanishing the next moment as suddenly as she had come. Now, this beautiful lady was the destiny of poor Catherine. Only a few days after this, the merchant heard the news that all his finest ships, laden with the richest merchandise, had been sunk in a storm, and he was left a beggar. The shock was too much for him. He took to his bed, and in a short time he was dead of his disappointment. So poor Catherine was left alone in the world without a penny or a creature to help her. But she was a brave girl, and full of spirit, and soon made up her mind that the best she could do was to go to the nearest town and become a servant. She lost no time in getting herself ready, and did not take long over her journey. And as she was passing down the chief street of the town, a noble lady saw her out of the window, and struck by her sad face, said to her, "Where are you going all alone, my pretty girl?" "Ah, my lady, I am very poor, and must go to service to earn my bread." "I will take you into my service," said she, and Catherine served her well. Some time after her mistress said to Catherine, "I am obliged to go out for a long while, and must lock the house door, so that no thieves shall get in." So she went away, and Catherine took her work and sat down at the window. Suddenly the door burst open, and in came Her Destiny. "Oh, so here you are, Catherine. Did you really think I was going to leave you in peace?" And as she spoke, she walked to the linen press where Catherine's mistress kept all her finest sheets and underclothes, tore everything in pieces, and flung them on the floor. Poor Catherine wrung her hands and wept, for she thought to herself, "When my lady comes back and sees all this ruin, she will think it is my fault," and starting up she fled through the open door. Then Destiny took all the pieces and made them whole again, and put them back in the press, and when everything was tidy, she too left the house. When the mistress reached home, she called Catherine, but no Catherine was there. "Can she have robbed me?" thought the old lady, and looked hastily round the house, but nothing was missing. She wondered why Catherine should have disappeared like this, but she heard no more of her, and in a few days she filled her place. Meanwhile, Catherine wandered on, without knowing very well where she was going, till at last she came to another town. Just as before, a noble lady happened to see her passing her window, and called out to her, "Where are you going all alone, my pretty girl?" And Catherine answered, "Ah, my lady, I am very poor, and must go to service to earn my bread." "I will take you into my service," said the lady, and Catherine served her well, and hoped she might now be left in peace. But exactly as before, one day that Catherine was left in the house alone, Her Destiny came again, and spoke to her with hard words. "What? Are you here now?" And in a passion she tore up everything she saw, till in a sheer misery poor Catherine rushed out of the house. And so it befell for 7 years, and directly Catherine found a fresh place, Her Destiny came forth and forced her to leave it. After 7 years, however, Destiny seemed to get tired of persecuting her, and a time of peace set in for Catherine. When she had been chased away from her last house by Destiny's wicked pranks, she had taken service with another lady who told her that it would be a part of her daily work to walk to a mountain that overshadowed the town, and, climbing up to the top, she was to lay on the ground some loaves of freshly baked bread, and cry with a loud voice, "O Destiny, my mistress," 3 times. Then her lady's Destiny would come and take away the offering. "That will I gladly do," said Catherine. So the years went by, and Catherine was still there, and every day she climbed the mountain with her basket of bread on her arm. She was happier than she had been, but sometimes, when no one saw her, she would weep as she thought over her old life, and how different it was to the one she was now leading. One day her lady saw her and said, "Catherine, what is it? Why are you always weeping?" And then Catherine told her story. "I have got an idea," exclaimed the lady. "Tomorrow, when you take the bread to the mountain, you shall pray my Destiny to speak to yours and entreat her to leave you in peace. Perhaps something may come of it." At these words Catherine dried her eyes, and next morning, when she climbed the mountain, she told all she had suffered, and cried, "O Destiny, my mistress, pray I entreat you of my Destiny that she may leave me in peace." And Destiny answered, "O my poor girl, know you not your Destiny lies buried under 7 coverlids, and can hear nothing? But if you will come tomorrow, I will bring her with me." And after Catherine had gone her way, her lady's Destiny went to find her sister, and said to her, "Dear sister, has not Catherine suffered enough? It is surely time for her good days to begin." And the sister answered, "Tomorrow you shall bring her to me, and I will give her something that may help her out of her need." The next morning Catherine set out earlier than usual for the mountain, and her lady's Destiny took the girl by the hand, and led her to her sister, who lay under the 7 coverlids. And her Destiny held out to Catherine a ball of silk, saying, "Keep this, it may be useful some day," and then pulled the coverings over her head again. But Catherine walked sadly down the hill, and went straight to her lady, and showed her the silken ball, which was the end of all her high hopes. "What shall I do with it?" she asked. "It is not worth 6pence, and it is no good to me." "Take care of it," replied her mistress. "Who can tell how useful it may be?" A little while after this, grand preparations were made for the king's marriage, and all the tailors in the town were busy embroidering fine clothes. The wedding garment was so beautiful nothing like it had ever been seen before. But when it was almost finished, the tailor found that he had no more silk. The colour was very rare, and none could be found like it, and the king made a proclamation that if anyone happened to possess any, they should bring it to the court, and he would give them a large sum. "Catherine," exclaimed the lady, who had been to the tailor's and had seen the wedding garment, "your ball of silk is exactly the right colour. Bring it to the king, and you can ask what you like for it." Then Catherine put on her best clothes, and went to the court, and looked more beautiful than any woman there. "May it please your majesty," she said, "I have brought you a ball of silk of the colour you asked for, as no one else has any in the town." "Your majesty," asked one of the courtiers, "shall I give the maiden its weight in gold?" The king agreed, and a pair of scales were brought, and a handful of gold was placed in one scale, and the silken ball in the other. But lo! Let the king lay in the scales as many gold pieces as he would, the silk was always heavier still. Then the king took some larger scales, and heaped up all his treasures on one side, but the silk on the other outweighed them all. At last there was only one thing left that had not been put in, and that was his golden crown. And he took it from his head, and set it on top of all, and at last the scale moved, and the ball had found its balance. "Where got you this silk?" asked the king. "It was given me, royal majesty, by my mistress," replied Catherine. "That is not true," said the king, "and if you do not tell me the truth, I will have your head cut off this instant." So Catherine told him the whole story, and how she had once been as rich as he. Now there lived at the court a wise woman, and she said to Catherine, "You have suffered much, my poor girl, but at length your luck has turned, and I know by the weighing of the scales through the crown that you will die a queen." "So she shall," cried the king, who overheard these words. "She shall die my queen, for she is more beautiful than all the ladies of the court, and I will marry no one else." And so it fell out. The king sent back the bride he had promised to wed to her own country, and the same Catherine was queen at the marriage feast instead, and lived happy and contented to the end of her life. The End.
Peter Bull, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. There once lived in Denmark a peasant and his wife, who owned a very good farm, but had no children. They often lamented to each other that they had no one of their own to inherit all the wealth that they possessed. They continued to prosper, and became rich people, but there was no heir to it all. One year it happened that they owned a pretty little bull calf, which they called Peter. It was the prettiest little creature that they had ever seen, so beautiful and so wise that it understood everything that was said to it, and so gentle and so full of play that both the man and his wife came to be fond of it as if it had been their own child. One day the man said to his wife, I wonder now whether our parish clerk could teach Peter to talk. In that case we could not do better than to adopt him as our son, and let him inherit all that we possess." "Well, I don't know," said his wife. "Our clerk's tremendously learned and knows much more than his paternoster, and I could almost believe that he might be able to teach Peter to talk, for Peter has a wonderfully good head too. You might at least ask him about it." Off the man went to the clerk, and asked him whether he thought he should teach a bull calf that they had to speak, for they had wished so much to have it as their heir. The clerk was no fool. He looked around, about to see that no one could overhear him, and said, "Oh, yes, I can easily do that, but you must not speak to anyone about it. I must be done in all secrecy, and the priest must not know of it. Otherwise I shall get into trouble, as it is forbidden. It will also cost you something, as that is very expensive books are required." That did not much matter at all, the man said. They would not care so much what it cost. The clerk could have $100 to begin with to buy the books. He almost promised to tell no one about it, and to bring the calf round in the evening. He gave the clerk the $100 on the spot, and in the evening took the calf round to him, and the clerk promised to do his best with it. In a week's time he came back to the clerk to hear about the calf, and see how it was thriving. The clerk, however, said that he could not get a sight of it, for then Peter would long after him and forget that all he had already learned. He was getting on well with his learning, but another $100 were needed, as they must have more books. The peasant had the money with him, so he gave it to the clerk, and went home again with high hopes. In another week the man came again to learn what progress Peter had made now. "He's getting along very well," said the clerk. "I suppose he can't say anything yet?" said the man. "Oh, yes," said the clerk. "He can say moo now." "Do you think he will get on with this learning?" asked the peasant. "Oh, yes," said the clerk, "but I shall want another $100 for books. Peter can't learn well out of the ones he has got." "Well, well," said the man, "what must be spent shall be spent." So he gave the clerk the third $100 for books, and a cask of good ale for Peter. The clerk drank the ale himself, and gave the calf milk, which he thought would be better for it. Some weeks passed, during which the peasant did not come round to ask after the calf, being frightened lest it should cost him another $100, for he had begun to squirm a bit about having to part with so much money. Meanwhile the clerk decided that the calf was as fat as it could be, so he killed it. After he had got all the beef out of the way, he went inside, put on his black clothes, and made his way to the peasant's house. As soon as he had said good day, he asked, "Has Peter come here?" "No, he hasn't," said the man. "Surely he hasn't run away." "I hope," said the clerk, "that he would not behave so contemptibly after all the trouble I have had to teach him, and all that I have spent upon him. I have spent at least $100 of my own money to buy books for him before I got him so far on. He could say anything he liked now, so he said today that he longed to see his parents again. I was willing to give him that pleasure, but I was afraid that he wouldn't be able to find the way here by himself, so I made myself ready to go with him. When we had got outside the house, I remembered that I had left my stick inside, and I went in again to get it. When I came out, Peter had gone off on his own account. I thought he would be here, and if he isn't, I don't know where he is." The peasant and his wife began to lament bitterly that Peter had run away in this fashion just when they were about to have so much joy of him, and after they had spent so much on his education. The worst of it was now that they had no heir at all. The clerk comforted them as best as he could. He was also greatly distressed that Peter should have behaved in such a way just when he had gone and gained honour from his pupil. Perhaps he had only gone astray, and he would advertise him at church next Sunday and find out where anyone had seen him. He then bade them good-bye and went home and dined on a good fat veal roast. Now it so happened that the clerk took in a newspaper, and one day he chanced to read in its columns of a new merchant who had settled in a town at some distance, and whose name was Peter Bull. He put the newspaper in his pocket, and went round to the sorrowing couple who had lost their hair. He read the paragraph to them, and added, "I wondered now whether that could be your bull-calf, Peter." "Yes, of course it is," said the man. "Who else could it be?" His wife then spoke up and said, "You must set out, good man, and see about him, for it is him, I am perfectly certain. Take a good sum of money with you, too, for who knows what he may want some cash now that he's turned into a merchant." The next day the man got a bag of money on his back and a sandwich in his pocket and a pipe in his mouth, and set for the town where the new merchant lived. It was no short way, and he travelled for many days before he finally arrived there. He reached it one morning, just at daybreak, found out the right place, and asked if the merchant was at home. "Yes, he was," said the people, "but he's not up yet." "That does not matter," said the peasant, "for I am his father. Just show me up to his bedroom." He was shown up to the room, and as soon as he entered it and caught sight of the merchant, he recognized him at once. He had the same broad forehead, the same thick neck, and the same red hair, but in all those respects he was now like a human being. The peasant rushed straight up to him and took a firm hold of him. "Oh, Peter," said he, "what a sorrow you have caused us, both myself and your mother, by running off like this, just as we had you well educated. Get up now, so that I can see you properly and have a talk with you." The merchant thought that it was a lunatic who had made his way into him, and thought he had best to take things quietly. "All right," said he, "I shall do so at once." He got out of bed and made haste to dress himself. "Ay," said the peasant, "now I can see how clever our clerk is. He has done well by you, for now you look just like a human being. If I didn't know it, one would never think that it was you we got from the Red Cow. Will you come home with me now?" "No," said the merchant, "I just can't find time now. I have a big business to look after." "You could have the farm at once, you know," said the peasant, "and we old people would retire. But if you would rather stay in business, of course you may do so. Or are you in want of anything?" "Oh, yes," said the merchant, "I want nothing so much as money. A merchant always has use for that." "I can well believe that," said the peasant, "for you had nothing at all to start with. I have brought some with me to that very end." With that he emptied his bag of money out upon the table, so that it was covered all with bright dollars. When the merchant saw what kind of man he had before him, he began to speak him fair, and invited him to stay with him for some days, so that they might have some more talk together. "Very well," said the peasant, "but you must call me father." "I have neither father nor mother alive," said Peter Bull. "I know that," said the man. "Your real father was sold at Hamburg last Michaelmas, and your real mother died while calving in spring, but my wife and I have adopted you as our own, and you are our only heir, so you must call me father." Peter Bull was quite willing to do so, and it was settled that he should keep the money, while the peasant made his will and left to him all that he had, before he went home to his wife and told her the whole story. She was delighted to hear that it was true enough about Peter Bull, that he was no other than their own bull-calf. "You must go at once and tell the clerk," said she, "and pay him the $100 of his own money that he spent upon our son. He has earned them well, and more besides, for all the joy he has given us in having such a son and heir." The man agreed with this, and thanked the clerk for all he had done, and gave him $200. Then he sold the farm and removed with his wife to the town where their dear son and heir was living. To him they gave all their wealth, and lived with him till their dying day. End of story.
Hans the Mermaid's Son, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. In a village there once lived a smith called Basmus, who was in a very poor way. He was still a young man, and a strong, handsome fellow to boot, but he had many little children, and there was little to be earned by his trade. He was, however, a diligent and hard-working man, and when he had no work in the smithy, he was out at sea fishing or gathering wreckage on the shore. It happened one time that he had gone out to fish in good weather, all alone in a little boat, but he did not come home that day, nor the following one, so that all believed he had perished out at sea. On the third day, however, Basmus came to shore again, and had his boat full of fish, so big and fat that no one had ever seen their like. There was nothing the matter with him, and he complained neither of hunger or thirst. He had got into a fog, he said, and could not find land again. What he did not tell, however, was where he had been all the time. That only came out 6 years later, when people got to know that he had been caught by a mermaid out on the deep sea, and had been her guest during the 3 days that he was missing. From that time forth he went out no more to fish, nor, indeed, did he require to do so, for whenever he went down to the shore, it never failed that some wreckage was washed up, and in it all kinds of valuable things. In those days everyone took what they found and got leave to keep it, so that the smith grew more prosperous day by day. When 7 years had passed since the smith went out to sea, it happened one morning, as he stood in the smithy, mending a plough, that a handsome young lad came in to him and said, "Good day, father. My mother the mermaid sends her greetings, and says that she has had me for 6 years now, and you can keep me for as long." He was a strange enough boy to be 6 years old, for he looked as if he were 18, and was even bigger and stronger than lads commonly are at that age. "Will you have a bite of bread?" said the smith. "Oh, yes," said Hans, for that was his name. The smith then told his wife to cut a piece of bread for him. She did so, and the boy swallowed it at one mouthful and went out again to the smithy to his father. "Have you got all you can eat?" said the smithy. "No," said Hans, "that was just a little bit." The smith went into the house and took a whole loaf, which he cut into 2 slices and put butter and cheese between them, and this he gave to Hans. In a while the boy came out to the smithy again. "Well, have you got as much as you can eat?" said the smith. "No, not nearly," said Hans. "I must try to find a better place than this, for I can see that I shall never get my fill here." Hans wished to set off at once, as soon as his father would make a staff for him of such a kind as he wanted. "It must be of iron," said he, "and one that can hold out." The smith brought him an iron rod as thick as an ordinary staff, but Hans took it and twisted it round his finger, so that wouldn't do. Then the smith came dragging one as thick as a wagon pole, but Hans bent it over his knee and broke it like a straw. The smith then had to collect all the iron he had, and Hans held it while his father forged for him a staff, which was heavier than the anvil. When Hans had got this, he said, "Many thanks, father. Now I have got my inheritance." With this he set off into the country, and the smith was very pleased to be rid of that son before he ate him out of house and home. Hans first arrived at a large estate, and it so happened that the squire himself was standing outside the farmyard. "Where are you going?" said the squire. "I am looking for a place," said Hans, "where they have need of strong fellows, and can give them plenty to eat." "Well," said the squire, "I generally have 24 men at this time of the year, but I have only 12 just now, so I can easily take you on." "Very well," said Hans, "I shall easily do 12 men's work, but then I must also have as much to eat as the 12 would." All this was agreed to, and the squire took Hans into the kitchen and told the servant girls that the new man was to have as much food as the other 12. It was arranged that he should have a pot to himself, and he could then use the ladle to take his food with. It was in the evening that Hans arrived there, so he did nothing more that day than eat his supper. A big pot of buckwheat porridge, which he cleaned to the bottom, and was then so far satisfied that he said he could sleep on that, so he went off to bed. He slept both well and long, and all the rest were up and at their work while he was still sleeping soundly. The squire was also on foot, for he was curious to see how the new man would behave who was both to eat and work for 12. But as yet there was no Hans to be seen, and the sun was already high in the heavens, so the squire himself went and called on him. "Get up, Hans," he cried, "you are sleeping too long." Hans woke up and rubbed his eyes. "Yes, that's true," he said, "I must get up and have my breakfast." So he rose and dressed himself and went into the kitchen, where he got his pot of porridge. He swallowed all of this, and then asked what work he was to have. He was to thresh that day, said the squire. The other 12 men were already busy at it. There were 12 threshing floors, and the 12 men were at work on 6 of them, 2 on each. There were several flails hanging there, and Hans took the one after the other, but they all went the same way, every one flying in splinters at the first stroke. He then looked round for something else to work with, and found a pair of strong beams lying near. Next he caught sight of a horsehide nailed up on the barn door. With the beams he made a flail, using the skin to tie them together. The one beam he used as a handle, and the other to strike with, and now that was all right. But the barn was too low. There was no room to swing the flail, and the floors were too small. Hans, however, found a remedy for this. He simply lifted the whole roof off the barn and set it down in the field beside. He then emptied down all the corn that he could lay his hands on and threshed away. He went through one lot after another, and it was all the same to him what he got hold of, so before midday he had threshed all the squire's grain, his rye and wheat and barley and oats, all mixed through each other. When he was finished with this, he lifted the roof up on the barn again, like setting a lid on a box, and went in and told the squire that the job was done. The squire opened his eyes at this announcement and came out to see if it was really true. It was true, sure enough, but he was scarcely delighted with the mixed grain that he got from all his crops. However, when he saw the flail that Hans had used and learned how he had made room for himself to swing it, he was so afraid of the strong fellow that he dared not say anything, except that it was a good thing he had got it threshed, but it had still to be cleaned. "What does that mean?" asked Hans. It was explained to him that the corn and the chaff had to be separated, as yet both were lying in one heap, right up to the roof. Hans began to take up a little and sift it in his hands, but he soon saw that this would never do. He soon thought of a plan, however. He opened both barn doors and then lay down at one end and blew, so that all the chaff flew out and lay like a sandbank at the other end of the barn, and the grain was as clean as it could be. Then he reported to the squire that that job also was done. The squire said that that was well. There was nothing more for him to do that day. Off went Hans to the kitchen and got as much as he could eat. Then he went and took a midday nap, which lasted till supper time. Meanwhile the squire was quite miserable, and made his moan to his wife, saying that she must help him to find some means to getting rid of this strong fellow, for he durst not give him his leave. She sent for the steward, and it was arranged that next day all the men should go to the forest for firewood, and that they should make a bargain among them that the one who came home last with his load should be hanged. They thought they could easily manage that it would be Hans who would lose his life, for the others would be early on the road, while Hans would certainly oversleep himself. In the evening, therefore, the men sat and talked together, saying that next morning they must set out early to the forest, and as they had a hard day's work and a long journey before them, they would, for their amusement, make a compact that whichever them came home last with his load should lose his life on the gallows. So Hans had no objections to make. Long before the sun was up next morning, all the 12 men were on foot. They took all the best horses and carts and drove off to the forest. Hans, however, lay and slept on, and the squire said, "Just let him lie." At last Hans thought it was time to have his breakfast, so he got up and put on his clothes. He took plenty of time to his breakfast, and then went out to get his horse and cart ready. The others had taken everything that was any good, so that he had a difficulty in scraping together 4 wheels of different sizes and fixing them to an old cart, and he could find no other horses than a pair of old hacks. He did not know where it lay, but he followed the track of the other carts, and in that way came to it all right. On coming to the gate leading into the forest, he was unfortunate enough to break it in pieces. So he took a huge stone that was lying on the field, 7 ells long and 7 ells broad, and set this in the gap. Then he went on and joined the others. These laughed at him heartily, for they had labored as hard as they could since daybreak, and had helped each other to fell trees and put them on the carts, so that all of these were now loaded except one. Hans got hold of a woodman's axe and proceeded to fell a tree, but he destroyed the edge and broke the shaft at the first blow. He therefore laid down the axe, put his arms round the tree, and pulled it up by the roots. This he threw upon his cart, and then another and another, and thus he went on while all the others forgot their work, and stood with open mouths, gazing at this strange woodcraft. All at once they began to hurry. The last cart was loaded, and they whipped up their horses, so as to be the first to arrive home. When Hans had finished his work, he again put his old hacks into the cart, but they could not move it from the spot. He was annoyed at this, and took them out again, twisted a rope round the cart and all the trees, lifted the whole affair on his back, and set off home, leading the horses behind him by the rein. When he reached the gate, he found the whole row of carts standing there, unable to get any further for the stone which lay in the gap. "What?" said Hans. "Can 12 men not move that stone?" With that he lifted it and threw it out of the way. and went on with his burden on his back, and the horses behind him, and arrived at the farm long before any of the others. The squire was walking about there, looking and looking, for he was very curious to know what had happened. Finally he caught sight of Hans coming along in this fashion, and was so frightened that he did not know what to do. But he shut the gate and put on the bar. When Hans reached the gate of the courtyard, he laid down the trees and hammered at it, but no one came to open it. He then took the trees and tossed them over the barn into the yard, and the cart after them, so that every wheel flew off in a different direction. When the squire saw this, he thought to himself, "The horses will come the same way if I don't open the door." So he did this. "Good day, master," said Hans, and put the horses into the stable, and went into the kitchen to get something to eat. At length the other men came home with their loads. When they came in, Hans said to them, "Do you remember the bargain we made last night? Which of you is it that's going to be hanged?" "Oh," said they, "that was only a joke. It didn't mean anything." "Oh, well, it doesn't matter," said Hans, and there was no more about it. The squire, however, and his wife and the steward had much to say to each other about the terrible man they had got, and all were agreed that they must get rid of him in some way or other. The steward said that he would manage this all right. Next morning they were to clean the well, and they would use of that opportunity. They would get him down into the well, and then have a big millstone ready to throw down on top of him. That would settle him. After that, they could just fill in the well, and then escape being at any expense for his funeral. Both the squire and his wife thought this a splendid idea, and went about rejoicing at the thought that now they would get rid of Hans. But Hans was hard to kill, as we shall see. He slept long next morning, as he always did, and finally, as he would not waken by himself, the squire had to go and call him. "Get up, Hans, you are sleeping too long," he cried. Hans woke up and rubbed his eyes. "That's so," said he. "I shall rise and have my breakfast." He got up then and dressed himself, while the breakfast stood waiting for him. When he had finished the whole of this, he asked what he was to do that day. He was told to help the other men to clean out the well. That was all right, and he went out and found the other men waiting for him. To these he said that they could choose whichever task they liked, either to go down into the well and fill the buckets while he pulled them up, or pull them up and he alone would go down to the bottom of the well. They answered that they would rather stay above ground, as there would be no room for so many of them down in the well. Hans therefore went down alone and began to clean out the well, but the men had arranged how they were to act, and immediately each of them seized a stone from a heap of huge blocks and threw them down above him, thinking to kill him with these. Hans, however, gave no more heed to this than to shout up to them to keep the hens away from the well, for they were scraping gravel down on the top of him. They then saw that they could not kill him with little stones, but they had still the big one left. The whole 12 of them set to work with poles and rollers, and rolled the big millstone to the brink of the well. It was with the greatest difficulty that they got it thrown down there, and now they had no doubt that he had got all that he wanted. But the stone happened to fall so luckily that his head went right through the hole in the middle of the millstone, so that it sat round his neck like a priest's collar. At this Hans would stay down no longer. He came out of the well with the millstone round his neck, and went straight to the squire and complained that the other men were trying to make a fool of him. He would not be their priest, he said. He had too little learning for that. Saying this, he bent down his head and shook the stone off, so that it crushed one of the squire's big toes. The squire went limping in to his wife, and the steward was sent for. He was told that he must devise some plan for getting rid of this terrible person. The scheme he had devised before had been of no use, and now good counsel was scarce. "Oh, no," said the steward, "there are good enough ways yet. The squire can send him this evening to fish in Devilmoss Lake. He will never escape alive from there, for no one can go there by night for old Eric." That was a grand idea, both the squire and his wife thought, and so he limped out again to Hans, and said that he would punish his men for having tried to make a fool of him. Meanwhile, Hans could do a little job where he would be free from these rascals. He should go out on the lake and fish there that night, and would then be free from all work on the following day. "All right," said Hans, "I am well content with that, but I must have something with me to eat, a baking of bread, a cask of butter, a barrel of ale, and a keg of brandy. I can't do with less than that." The squire said that he could easily get all that, so Hans got all of these tied up together, hung them over his shoulder on his good staff, and tramped away to Devilmoss Lake. There he got into the boat, rowed out upon the lake, and got everything ready to fish. As he now lay out there in the middle of the lake, and it was pretty late in the evening, he thought he would have something to eat first, before starting to work. Just as he was at his busiest with this, old Eric rose out of the lake, caught him by the cuff of the neck, whipped him out of the boat, and dragged him down to the bottom. It was a lucky thing that Hans had his walking stick with him that day, and had just time to catch hold of it when he felt old Eric's claws in his neck. So when they got down to the bottom, he said, "Stop now, just wait a little. Here is solid ground." With that, he caught old Eric by the back of the neck with one hand, and hammered away on his back with the staff, till he beat him out as flat as a pancake. Old Eric then began to lament and howl, begging him just to let him go, and he would never come back to the lake again. "No, my good fellow," said Hans, "you won't get off until you promise to bring all the fish in the lake up to the squire's courtyard before tomorrow morning." Old Eric eagerly promised this, if Hans would only let him go. So Hans rowed ashore, ate up the rest of his provisions, and went home to bed. Next morning, when the squire rose and opened his front door, the fish came tumbling into the porch, and the whole yard was crammed full of them. He ran in again to his wife, for he could never devise anything himself, and said to her, "What shall we do with him now? Old Eric hasn't taken him. I am certain that all the fish are out of the lake, for the yard is just filled with them." "Yes, that's a bad business," said she. "You must see if you can't get him sent to purgatory to demand tribute." The squire therefore made his way to the men's quarters to speak to Hans, and it took him all his time to push his way along the walls, under the eaves, on account of the fish that filled the yard. He thanked Hans for having fished so well, and said that now he had an errand for him, which he could only give to a trusty servant, and that was to journey to purgatory and demand 3 years' tribute, which he said was owing to him from that quarter. "Willingly," said Hans, "but what road do I go to get there?" The squire stood and did not know what to say, and had first to go in to his wife to ask her. "Oh, what a fool you are," said she. "Can't you direct him straight forward south through the wood? Whether he gets there or not, we shall be quit of him." Out goes the squire again to Hans. "The way lies straight forward south through the wood," said he. Hans then must have his provisions for the journey, 2 bakings of bread, 2 casks of butter, 2 barrels of ale, and 2 kegs of brandy. He tied all these up together, and got them on his shoulder, hanging on his good walking stick, and off he tramped southward. After he had got through the wood, there was more than one road, and he was in doubt which of them was the right one. So he sat down and opened up his bundle of provisions. He found he had left his knife at home, but by good chance there was a plough lying close at hand, so he took the coulter of this to cut the bread with. As he sat there and took his bite, a man came riding past him. "Where are you from?" said Hans. "From purgatory," said the man. "Then stop and wait a little," said Hans, but the man was in a hurry, and would not stop, so Hans ran after him and caught the horse by the tail. This brought it down on its hind legs, and the man went flying over its head into a ditch. "Just wait a little," said Hans. "I am going the same way." He got his provisions tied up again, and laid them on the horse's back. Then he took hold of the reins, and said to the man, "We two can go along together on foot." As they went on their way, Hans told the stranger both about the errand he had on hand, and the fun he had had with old Eric. The other said but little, but he was well acquainted with the way, and it was no long time before they arrived at the gate. There both horse and rider disappeared, and Hans was left alone outside. "They will come and let me in presently," he thought to himself, but no one came. He hammered at the gate, still no one appeared. Then he got tired of waiting, and smashed at the gate with his staff until he knocked it in pieces and got inside. A whole troop of little demons came down upon him and asked what he wanted. "His master's compliments," said Hans, and he wanted 3 years' tribute. At this they howled at him, and were about to lay hold of him and drag him off, but when they had got some raps from his walking-stick, they let go again, howled still louder than before, and ran in to old Eric, who was still in bed, after his adventure in the lake. They told him that a messenger had come from the squire at Devilmoss to demand 3 years' tribute. He had knocked the gate to pieces and bruised their arms and legs with his iron staff. "Give him 3 years! Give him 10!" shouted old Eric. "Only don't let him come near me!" So all the little demons came dragging so much silver and gold that it was something awful. Hans filled his bundle with gold and silver coins, put it on his neck, and tramped back to his master, who was scared beyond all measure at seeing him again. But Hans was also tired of service now. Of all the gold and silver he brought with him, he let the squire keep 1/2, and he was glad enough, both for the money and at getting rid of Hans. The other half he took home to his father, the smith, in Furby. To him also he said farewell. He was now tired of living on shore among mortal men, and preferred to go home again to his mother. Since that time no one has ever seen Hans, the mermaid's son. The end.
The House in the Wood, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. A poor woodcutter lived with his wife and 3 daughters in a little hut on the borders of a great forest. One morning, as he was going to his work, he said to his wife, "Let our eldest daughter bring me my lunch into the wood, and so that she shall not lose her way, I will take a bag of millet with me and sprinkle the seed on the path." When the sun had risen high over the forest, the girl set out with a basin of soup. But the field and wood sparrows, the larks and finches, blackbirds and greenfinches, had picked up the millet long ago, and the girl could not find her way. She went on, till the sun set and night came on. The trees rustled in the darkness, the owls hooted, and she began to be very much frightened. Then she saw in the distance a light that twinkled between the trees. "There must be people living yonder," she thought, "who will take me in for the night," and she began walking towards it. Not long afterwards she came to a house with lights in the windows. She knocked at the door, and a gruff voice called, "Come in." The girl stepped into the dark entrance and tapped at the door of the room. "Just walk in," cried the voice, and when she opened the door, there sat an old grey-haired man at the table. His face was resting on his hands, and his white beard overflowed over the table almost down to the ground. By the stove lay 3 beasts, a hen, a cock, and a bridled cow. The girl told the old man her story and asked for a night's lodging. The man said, "Pretty cock, pretty hen, and you, pretty bridled cow, what do you say now?" "Ducks," answered the beasts, and must have meant, "We are quite willing," for the old man went on, "Here is abundance. Go into the back kitchen and cook us a supper." The girl found plenty of everything in the kitchen, and cooked a good meal, but she did not think of the beasts. She placed the full dishes on the table, sat down opposite the grey-haired man, and ate till her hunger was appeased. When she was satisfied, she said, "But now I am so tired, where is a bed in which I can sleep?" The beasts answered, "You have eaten with him, you have drunk with him, of us you have not thought, sleep then as you ought." Then the old man said, "Go upstairs, and there you will find a bedroom. Shake the bed and put clean sheets on, and go to sleep." The maiden went upstairs, and when she had made the bed she lay down. After some time the grey-haired man came, looked at her by the light of his candle, and shook his head. And when he saw that she was sound asleep, he opened a trap-door and let her fall into the cellar. The woodcutter came home late in the evening and reproached his wife for leaving him all day without food. "No, I did not," she answered. "The girl went off with your dinner. She must have lost her way, but will no doubt come back tomorrow." But at daybreak the woodcutter started off into the wood, and this time asked his second daughter to bring his food. "I will take a bag of lentils," said he. "They are larger than millet, and the girl will see them better and be sure to find her way." At midday the maiden took the food, but the lentils had all gone, as on the previous day the wood-birds had eaten them all. The maiden wandered about the wood till nightfall, when she came in the same way to the old man's house and asked for food and a night's lodging. The man with the white hair again asked the beasts, "Pretty cock, pretty hen, and you, pretty bridled cow, what do you say now?" The beast answered, "Dux," and everything happened as on the former day. The girl cooked a good meal, ate and drank with the old man, and did not trouble herself about the animals. And when she asked for a bed, they replied, "You have eaten with him, you have drunk with him, of us you have not thought, now sleep as you ought." And when she was asleep, the old man shook his head over her and let her fall into the cellar. On the third morning the woodcutter said to his wife, "Send our youngest child today with my dinner. She is always good and obedient, and will keep to the right path, and not wander away like her sisters, idle drones." But the mother said, "Must I lose my dearest child too?" "Do not fear," he answered. "She is too clever and intelligent to lose her way. I will take plenty of peas with me and strew them along. They are even larger than lentils, and will show her the way." But when the maiden started off with the basket on her arm, the wood-pigeons had eaten up the peas, and she did not know which way to go. She was much distressed, and thought constantly of her poor hungry father and her anxious mother. At last, when it grew dark, she saw the little light, and came to the house in the wood. She asked prettily if she might stay there for the night, and the man with the white beard asked his beasts again, "Pretty cock, pretty hen, and you, pretty bridled cow, what do you say now?" "Dux," they said. Then the maiden stepped up to the stove where the animals were lying, and stroked the cock and the hen, and scratched the bridled cow between its horns. And when at the bidding of the old man she had prepared a good supper, and the dishes were standing on the table, she said, "Shall I have plenty, while the good beasts have nothing? There is food to spare outside. I will attend to them first." Then she went out and fetched barley, and strewed it before the cock and hen, and brought the cow an armful of sweet-smelling hay. "Eat that, dear beasts," she said, "and when you are thirsty, you shall have a good drink." Then she fetched a bowl of water, and the cock and hen flew on to the edge, put their beaks in, and then held up their heads as birds do when they drink, and the bridled cow also drank her fill. When the beasts were satisfied, the maiden sat down beside the old man at the table, and ate what was left for her. Soon the cock and hen began to tuck their heads under their wings, and the bridled cow blinked its eyes, so the maiden said, "Shall we not go to rest now? Pretty cock, pretty hen, and you, pretty bridled cow, what do you say now?" The animals said, "Dux, you have eaten with us, you have drunk with us, you have tended us right, so we wish you good night." The maiden therefore went upstairs, made the bed, and put on clean sheets, and fell asleep. She slept peacefully till midnight, when there was such a noise in the house that she awoke. Everything trembled and shook. The animals sprang up and dashed themselves in terror against the wall. The beams swayed as if they would be torn from their foundations. It seemed as if the stairs were tumbling down, and then the roof fell in with a crash. Then all became still, and as no harm came to the maiden, she lay down again and fell asleep. But when she awoke again in broad daylight, what a sight met her eyes! She was lying in a splendid room furnished with royal splendor. The walls were covered with golden flowers on a green ground. The bed was of ivory, and the counterpane of velvet, and on a stool near by lay a pair of slippers studded with pearls. The maiden thought she must be dreaming, but in came 3 servants, richly dressed, who asked what were her commands. "Go," said the maiden. "I will get up at once and cook the old man's supper for him, and then I will feed the pretty cock and hen and the bridled cow." But the door opened, and in came a handsome young man, who said, "I am a king's son, and was condemned by a wicked witch to live as an old man in this wood with no company but that of my 3 servants, who were transformed into a cock, a hen, and a bridled cow. The spell could only be broken by the arrival of a maiden who should show herself kind not only to men, but to beasts. You are that maiden, and last night at midnight we were freed, and this poor house was again transformed into my royal palace." As they stood there, the king's son told his 3 servants to go and fetch the maiden's parents to be present at the wedding feast. "But where are my 2 sisters?" asked the maid. "I shut them up in the cellar, but in the morning they shall be led forth into the forest, and shall serve a charcoal burner until they have improved, and will never again suffer poor animals to go hungry." The end.
How the Dragon Was Tricked, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time there lived a man who had 2 sons, but they did not get on at all well together, for the younger was much handsomer than his elder brother, who was very jealous of him. When they grew older, things became worse and worse, and at last one day, as they were walking through a wood, the elder youth seized hold of the other, tied him to a tree, and went on his way, hoping that the boy might starve to death. However, it happened that an old and humpbacked shepherd passed the tree with his flock, and seeing the prisoner, he stopped and said to him, "Tell me, my son, why are you tied to that tree?" "Because I was so crooked," answered the young man, "but it has quite cured me, and now my back is as straight as can be." "I wish you could bind me to a tree," exclaimed the shepherd, "so that my back would get straight." "With all the pleasure in life," replied the youth. "If you will loosen these cords, I will tie you up with them as firmly as I can." This was soon done, and then the young man drove off the sheep, leaving their real shepherd to repent of his folly, and before he had gone very far he met with a horse-boy and a driver of oxen, and he persuaded them to turn with him and to seek for adventures. By these and many other tricks he soon became so celebrated that his fame reached the king's ears, and his majesty was filled with curiosity to see the man who had managed to outwit everybody. So he commanded his guards to capture the young man and bring him before him. And when the young man stood before the king spoke to him and said, "By your tricks and the pranks that you have played on other people, you have, in the eye of the law, forfeited your life. But on one condition I will spare you, and that is, if you will bring me the flying horse that belongs to the great dragon. Fail in this, and you shall be hewn in 1,000 pieces." "If that is all," said the youth, "you shall soon have it." So he went out and made his way straight to the stable where the flying horse was tethered. He stretched his hand cautiously out to seize the bridle, when the horse suddenly began to neigh as loud as he could. Now the room in which the dragon slept was just above the stable, and at the sound of the neighing he woke and cried to the horse, "What is the matter, my treasure? Is anything hurting you?" After waiting a little while, the young man tried again to loose the horse, but a second time it neighed so loudly that the dragon woke up in a hurry and called out to know why the horse was making such a noise. But when the same thing happened the third time, the dragon lost his temper and went down into the stable and took a whip and gave the horse a good beating. This offended the horse and made him angry, and when the young man stretched out his hand to untie his head, he made no further fuss, but suffered himself to be led quietly away. Once clear of the stable, the young man sprang on his back and galloped off, calling over his shoulder, "Hi, Dragon! Dragon! If anyone asks you what has become of your horse, you can say that I have got him." But the king said, "The flying horse is all very well, but I want something more. You must bring me the covering with the little bells that lies on the bed of the dragon, or I will have you hewn into 1,000 pieces." "Is that all?" answered the youth. "That is easily done." And when night came, he went away to the dragon's house and climbed up on to the roof. Then he opened a little window in the roof and let down the chain from which the kettle usually hung, and tried to hook the bed covering and to draw it up. But the little bells all began to ring, and the dragon woke and said to his wife, "Wife, you have pulled off all the bedclothes," and drew the covering towards him, pulling, as he did so, the young man into the room. Then the dragon flung himself on the youth and bound him fast with cords, saying, as he tied the last knot, "Tomorrow, when I go to church, you must stay at home and kill him and cook him, and when I get back we will eat him together." So the following morning the dragoness took hold of the young man and reached down from the shelf a sharp knife with which to kill him. But as she untied the cords, the better to get hold of him, the prisoner caught her by the legs, threw her to the ground, seized her, and speedily cut her throat, just as she had been about to do for him, and put her body in the oven. Then he snatched up the covering and carried it to the king. The king was seated on his throne when the youth appeared before him and spread out the covering with a deep bow. "That is not enough," said his majesty. "You must bring me the dragon himself, or I will have you hewn into 1,000 pieces." "It shall be done," answered the youth, "but you must give me 2 years to manage it, for my beard must grow so that he may not know me." "So be it," said the king. And the first thing the young man did when his beard was grown was to take the road to the dragon's house, and on the way he met a beggar, whom he persuaded to change clothes with him, and in the beggar's garments he went fearlessly forth to the dragon. He found his enemy before his house very busy making a box, and addressed him politely. "Good morning, your worship. Have you a morsel of bread?" "You must wait," replied the dragon, "till I have finished my box, and then I will see if I can find one." "What will you do with the box when it is made?" inquired the beggar. "It is for the young man who killed my wife, and stole my flying horse, and my bed covering," said the dragon. "He deserves nothing better," answered the beggar, "for it was an ill deed. Still, that box is too small for him, for he is a big man." "You are wrong," said the dragon. "The box is large enough even for me." "Well, the rogue is nearly as tall as you," replied the beggar, "and of course, if you can get in, he can. But I am sure you would find it a tight fit." "No, there is plenty of room," said the dragon, tucking himself carefully inside. But no sooner was he well in than the young man clapped on the lid and called out, "Now press hard, just to see if he will be able to get out." The dragon pressed as hard as he could, but the lid never moved. "It is all right," he cried. "Now you can open it." But instead of opening it, the young man drove in long nails to make it tighter still. Then he took the box on his back and brought it to the king. And when the king heard that the dragon was inside, he was so excited that he would not wait one moment, but broke the lock and lifted the lid just a little way to make sure he was really there. He was very careful not to leave enough space for the dragon to jump out. But unluckily there was just room for his great mouth, and with one snap the king vanished down his wide red jaws. Then the young man married the king's daughter and ruled over the land, but what he did with the dragon nobody knows. The end.
How the Hermit Helped to Win the King's Daughter, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Long ago there lived a very rich man who had 3 sons. When he felt himself to be dying, he divided his property between them, making them share alike, both in money and lands. Soon after he died, the king set forth a proclamation through the whole country that whoever could build a ship that should float both on land and sea should have his daughter to wife. The oldest brother, when he heard it, said to the other, "I think I will spend some of my money in trying to build that ship, as I should like to have the king for my father-in-law." So he called together all the shipbuilders in the land, and gave them orders to begin the ship without delay. And trees were cut down, and great preparations were made, and in a few days everybody knew what it was all for. And there was a crowd of old people pressing round the gates of the yard where the young man spent the most of his day. "Ah, master, give us work," they said, "so that we may earn our bread." But he only gave them hard words and spoke roughly to them. You are old, and have lost your strength. Of what use are you? And he drove them away. Then came some boys, and prayed him, Master, give us work. But he answered them, Of what use can you be, weaklings as you are? Get you gone. And if any presented themselves that were not skilled workmen, he would have none of them. At last there knocked at the gate a little old man with a long white beard, and said, Will you give me work, so that I may earn my bread? But he was only driven away like the rest. The ship took a long while to build, and cost a great deal of money, and when it was launched, a sudden squall rose, and it fell to pieces, and with it all the young man's hope of winning the princess. By this time he had not a penny left, so he went back to his two brothers and told his tale. And the second brother said to himself as he listened, Certainly he has managed very badly, but I should like to see if I can't do better, and win the princess for my own self. So he called together all the shipbuilders throughout the country, and gave them orders to build a ship which should float on the land as well as on the sea. But his heart was no softer than his brother's, and every man that was not a skilled workman was chased away with hard words. Last came the white-bearded man, but he fared no better than the rest. When the ship was finished, the launch took place, and everything seemed going smoothly when a gale sprang up, and the vessel was dashed to pieces on the rocks. The young man had spent his whole fortune on it, and now it was all swallowed up, was forced to beg shelter from his youngest brother. When he told his story, the youngest said to himself, I am not rich enough to support us all three. I had better take my turn, and if I manage to win the princess, there will be her fortune as well as my own for us to live on. So he called together all the shipbuilders in the kingdom, and gave orders that a new ship should be built. Then all the old people came and asked for work, and he answered cheerfully, Oh yes, there is plenty for everybody. And when the boys begged to be allowed to help, he found something that they could do. And when the old man with the long white beard stood before him, praying that he might earn his bread, he replied, O father, I could not suffer you to work, but you shall be overseer and look after the rest. Now the old man was a holy hermit, and when he saw how kind-hearted the youth was, he determined to do all he could for him to gain the wish of his heart. By and by, when the ship was finished, the hermit said to his young friend, Now you can go and claim the king's daughter, for the ship will float both by land and sea. O good father, cried the young man, you will not forsake me? Stay with me, I pray you, and lead me to the king. If you wish it, I will, said the hermit, on condition that you will give me half of anything you get. Oh, if that is all, answered he, it is easily promised. And they set out together on the ship. After they had gone some distance, they saw a man standing in a thick fog which he was trying to put into a sack. O good father, exclaimed the youth, what can he be doing? Ask him, said the old man. What are you doing, my fine fellow? I am putting the fog into my sack. That is my business. Ask him if he will come with us, whispered the hermit. And the man answered, If you will give me enough to eat and drink, I will gladly stay with you. So they took him on their ship, and the youth said, as they started off again, Good father, before we were 2, and now we are 3. After they had travelled a little further, they met a man who had torn up half the forest, and was carrying all the trees on his shoulders. Good father, exclaimed the youth, only look, what can he have done that for? Ask him why he has torn up all those trees. And the man replied, Why, I've merely been gathering a handful of brushwood. Beg him to come with us, whispered the hermit. And the strong man answered, Willingly, as long as you give me enough to eat and drink. And he came on the ship. And the youth said to the hermit, Good father, before we were 3, and now we are 4. The ship travelled on again, and some miles further on they saw a man drinking out of a stream till he had nearly drunk it dry. Good father, said the youth, just look at that man. Did you ever see anybody drink like that? Ask him why he does it, answered the hermit. Why, there is nothing very odd in taking a mouthful of water, replied the man, standing up. Beg him to come with us. And the youth did so. With pleasure, as long as you give me enough to eat and drink. And the youth whispered to the hermit, Good father, before we were 4, and now we are 5. A little way along they noticed another man in the middle of a stream who was shooting into the water. Good father, said the youth, what can he be shooting at? Ask him, answered the hermit. Hush, "Hush!" cried the man. "Now you have frightened it away. In the underworld sits a quail on a tree, and I wanted to shoot it. That is my business. I hit everything I aim at." "Ask him if he will come with us." And the man replied, "With all my heart, as long as I get enough to eat and drink." So they took him into the ship, and the young man whispered, "Good father, before we were 5, and now we are 6." Off they went again, and before they had gone far they met a man striding towards them whose steps were so long that while one foot was on the north of the island, the other was right down in the south. "Good father, look at him! What long steps he takes!" "Ask him why he does it," replied the hermit. "Oh, I am only going out for a little walk," answered he. "Ask him if he will come with us." "Gladly, if you will give me as much as I want to eat and drink," said he, climbing up into the ship. And the young man whispered, "Good father, before we were 6, and now we are 7." But the hermit knew what he was about, and why he gathered these strange people into the ship. After many days, at last, they reached the town where lived the king and his daughter. They stopped the vessel right in front of the palace, and the young man went in and bowed low before the king. "O Majesty, I have done your bidding, and now is the ship built that can travel over land and sea. Give me my reward, and let me have your daughter to wife." But the king said to himself, "What? Am I to wed my daughter to a man of whom I know nothing, not even whether he be rich or poor, a knight or a beggar?" And aloud he spake, "It is not enough that you have managed to build the ship. You must find a runner who shall take this letter to the ruler of the underworld and bring me the answer back in an hour." "That is not in the bond," answered the young man. "Well, do as you like," replied the king, "only you will not get my daughter." The young man went out, sorely troubled, to tell his old friend what had happened. "Silly boy!" cried the hermit. "Accept his terms at once, and send off the long-legged man with the letter. He will take it in no time at all." So the youth's heart leapt for joy, and he returned to the king. "Majesty, I accept your terms. Here is the messenger who will do what you wish." The king had no choice but to give the man the letter, and he strode off, making short work of the distance that lay between the palace and the underworld. He soon found the ruler, who looked at the letter and said to him, "Wait a little while I write the answer." But the man was so tired with his quick walk that he went sound asleep and forgot all about his errand. All this time the youth was anxiously counting the minutes till he could get back, and stood with his eyes fixed on the road down which his messenger must come. "What can be keeping him?" he said to the hermit, when the hour was nearly up. Then the hermit sent for the man who could hit everything he aimed at, and said to him, "Just see why the messenger stays so long." "Oh, he is so sound asleep in the palace of the underworld. However, I can wake him." Then he drew his bow and shot an arrow straight into the man's knee. The messenger awoke with such a start, and when he saw that the hour had almost run out, he snatched up the answer and rushed back with such speed that the clock had not yet struck when he entered the palace. Now the young man thought he was sure of his bride, but the king said, "Still you have not done enough. Before I give you my daughter, you must find a man who can drink half the contents of my cellar in one day." "That is not in the bond," complained the poor youth. "Well, do as you like, only you will not get my daughter." The young man went sadly out, and asked the hermit what he was to do. "Silly boy," said he, "why, tell the man to do it who drinks up everything." So they sent for the man and said, "Do you think you are able to drink half the royal cellar in one day?" "Dear me, yes, and as much more as you want," answered he. "I am never satisfied." The king was not pleased at the young man agreeing so readily, but he had no choice, and ordered the servant to be taken downstairs. Oh, how he enjoyed himself! All day long he drank and drank and drank, till instead of half the cellar he had drunk the whole, and there was not a cask but what stood empty. And when the king saw this, he said to the youth, "You have conquered, and I can no longer withhold my daughter. But as her dowry I shall only give so much as one man can carry away. But," answered he, "let a man be ever so strong, he cannot carry more than 100 weight, and what is that for a king's daughter? Well, do as you like. I have had my say. It is your affair, not mine." The young man was puzzled, and did not know what to reply, for, though he would gladly have married the princess without a sixpence, he had spent all his money in building the ship, and knew he could not give her all she wanted. So he went to the hermit and said to him, "The king will only give for her dowry as much as a man can carry. I have no money of my own left, and my brothers have none either." "Silly boy! Why, you have only got to fetch the man who carried half the forest on his shoulders." And the youth was glad, and called the strong man, and told him what he must do. "Take everything you can till you are bent double. Never mind if you leave the palace bare." The strong man promised, and nobly kept his word. He piled all he could see on his back, chairs, tables, wardrobes, chests of gold and silver, till there was nothing left to pile. At last he took the king's crown and put it on the top. He carried his burden to the ship and stowed his treasures away, and the youth followed, leading the king's daughter. But the king was left raging in his empty palace, and he called together his army and got ready his ships of war in order that he might go after the vessel and bring back what had been taken away. And the king's ships sailed very fast, and soon caught up the little vessel, and the sailors all shouted for joy. Then the hermit looked out and saw how near they were, and he said to the youth, "Do you see that?" The youth shrieked and cried, "Ah, good father, it is a fleet of ships, and they are chasing us, and in a few moments they will be upon us." But the hermit bade him call the man who had the fog in his sack, and the sack was opened, and the fog flew out and hung right round the king's ships, so that they could see nothing. So they sailed back to the palace, and told the king what strange things had happened. Meanwhile the young man's vessel reached home in safety. "Well, here you are once more," said the hermit, "and now you can fulfill the promise you made to give me half of all you had." "That will I do with all my heart," answered the youth, and began to divide all his treasures, putting part on one side for himself, and setting aside the other for his friend. "Good father, it is finished," said he at length. "There is nothing more left to divide." "Nothing more left?" cried the hermit. "Why, you have forgotten the best thing of all." "What can that be?" asked he. "We have divided everything." "And the king's daughter?" said the hermit. Then the young man's heart stood still, for he loved her dearly. But he answered, "It is well. I have sworn, and I will keep my word," and drew his sword to cut her to pieces. When the hermit saw that he held his honor dearer than his wife, he lifted his hand and cried, "Hold! She is yours, and all the treasures too. I gave you my help because you had pity on those that were in need, and when you are in need yourself, call upon me, and I will come to you." As he spoke, he softly touched their heads and vanished. The next day the wedding took place, and the two brothers came to the house, and they all lived happily together. But they never forgot the holy man who had been such a good friend. The End.
The Cunning Shoemaker. From the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time there lived a shoemaker who could get no work to do, and was so poor that he and his wife nearly died of hunger. At last he said to her, "It is no use waiting on here. I can find nothing, so I shall go down to Mascalucia, and perhaps there I shall be more lucky." So down he went to Mascalucia, and walked through the streets crying, "Who wants some shoes?" And very soon a window was pushed up, and a woman's head was thrust out of it. "Here are a pair for you to patch," she said, and he sat down on her doorstep and set about patching them. "How much do I owe you?" she asked when they were done. "A shilling." "Here is 18 pence, and good luck to you." And he went on his way. He turned into the next street and set up his cry again, and it was not long before another window was pushed up and another head appeared. "Here are some shoes for you to patch." And the shoemaker sat down on the doorstep and patched them. "How much do I owe you?" asked the woman when the shoes were finished. "A florin." "Here is a crown piece, and good luck to you." And she shut the window. "Well," thought the shoemaker, "I have done finely, but I will not go back to my wife just yet, as if I only go on at this rate I shall soon have enough money to buy a donkey." Having made up his mind what was best to do, he stayed in the town a few days longer, till he had 4 gold pieces safe in his purse. Then he went to the market, and for 2 of them he bought a good strong donkey, and mounting on its back he rode home to Catania. But as he entered a thick wood, he saw in the distance a band of robbers who were coming quickly towards him. "I am lost," thought he. "They are sure to take from me all the money that I have earned, and I shall be as poor as ever I was. What can I do?" However, being a clever little man and full of spirit, he did not lose heart, but taking 5 florins, he fastened them out of sight under the donkey's thick mane. Then he rode on. Directly the robbers came up to him, they seized him exactly as he had foretold, and took away all his money. "Oh, dear friends," he cried, wringing his hands, "I am only a poor shoemaker, and have nothing but this donkey left in the world." As he spoke, the donkey gave himself a shake, and down fell the 5 florins. "Where did that come from?" asked the robbers. "Ah," replied the shoemaker, "you have guessed my secret. The donkey is a golden donkey, and supplies me with all my money." "Sell him to us," said the robbers. "We will give you any price you like." The shoemaker at first declared that nothing would induce him to sell him, but at last he agreed to hand him over to the robbers for 50 gold pieces. "But listen to what I tell you," said he. "You must each take it in turn to own him for a night and a day, or else you will all be fighting over the money." With these words they parted, the robbers driving the donkey to their cave in the forest, and the shoemaker returning home, very pleased with the success of his trick. He just stopped on the way to pick up a good dinner, and the next day spent most of his gains in buying a small vineyard. Meanwhile the robbers had arrived at the cave where they lived, and the captain, calling them all round him, announced that it was his right to have the donkey for the first night. His companions agreed, and then he told his wife to put a mattress in the stable. She asked if he had gone out of his mind, but he answered crossly, "What is that to you? Do as you are bid, and tomorrow I will bring you some treasures." Very early the captain awoke and searched the stable, but could find nothing, and guessed that Master Joseph had been making fun of them. "Well," he said to himself, "if I have been taken in, the others shall not come off any better." So when one of his men arrived and asked him eagerly how much money he had got, he answered gaily, "Oh, comrade, if you only knew! But I shall say nothing about it till everyone has had his turn." One after another they all took the donkey, but no money was forthcoming for anybody. At length, when all the band had been tricked, they held a council, and resolved to march to the shoemaker's house and punish him well for his cunning. Just as before, the shoemaker saw them a long way off, and began to think how he could outwit them again. When he had hit upon a plan, he called his wife and said to her, "Take a bladder and fill it with blood, and bind it round your neck. When the robbers come and demand the money they gave me for the donkey, I shall shout to you and tell you to get it quickly. You must argue with me and decline to obey me, and then I shall plunge my knife into the bladder, and you must fall to the ground as if you were dead. There you must lie till I play on my guitar, then get up and begin to dance." The wife made haste to do as she was bid, and there was no time to lose, for the robbers were drawing very near the house. They entered with a great noise, and overwhelmed the shoemaker with reproaches for having deceived them about the donkey. "The poor beast must have lost its power, owing to the change of masters," said he. "But he will not quarrel about it. You shall have back the 50 gold pieces that you gave for him." "Aita," he cried to his wife, "go quickly to the chest upstairs, and bring down the money for these gentlemen." "Wait a little," answered she. "I must first bake this fish. It will be spoilt if I leave it now." "Go this instant as you are bid," shouted the shoemaker, stamping as if he was in a great passion. But as she did not stir, he drew his knife and stabbed her in the neck. The blood spurted out freely, and she fell to the ground as if she was dead. "What have you done?" asked the robbers, looking at him in dismay. "The poor woman was doing nothing." "Perhaps I was hasty, but it is easily set right," replied the shoemaker, taking down his guitar and beginning to play. Hardly had he struck the first notes than his wife sat up, then got on her feet and danced. The robbers stared with open mouths, and at last they said, "Master Joseph, you may keep the 50 gold pieces, but tell us what you will take for your guitar, for you must sell it to us." "Oh, that is impossible," replied the shoemaker, "for every time I have a quarrel with my wife, I just strike her dead, and so give vent to my anger. This has become such a habit with me that I don't think I could break myself of it. And, of course, if I got rid of the guitar, I could never bring her back to life again." However, the robbers would not listen to him, and at last he consented to take 40 gold pieces for the guitar. Then they all returned to their cave in the forest, delighted with their new purchase, and longing for a chance of trying its powers. But the captain declared that the first trial belonged to him, and after that the others might have their turn. That evening he called to his wife and said, "What have you got for supper?" "Macaroni," answered she. "Why have you not boiled a fish?" he cried, and stabbed her in the neck so that she fell dead. The captain, who was not in the least angry, seized the guitar and began to play. But let him play as loud as he would, the dead woman never stirred. "O lying shoemaker! O abominable knave! Twice has he got the better of me, but I will pay him out." So he raged and swore, but it did him no good. The fact remained that he had killed his wife and could not bring her back again. The next morning came one of the robbers to fetch the guitar and to hear what had happened. "Well, how have you got on?" "Oh, splendidly! I stabbed my wife and then began to play, and now she is as well as ever." "Did you really? Then this evening I will try for myself." Of course, the same thing happened over again till all the wives had been killed secretly, and when there were no more left, they whispered to each other the dreadful tale, and swore to be avenged on the shoemaker. The band lost no time in setting out for his house, and as before, the shoemaker saw them coming from afar. He called to his wife, who was washing in the kitchen. "Listen, Aita, when the robbers come and ask for me, say I have gone to the vineyard. Then tell the dog to call me, and chase him from the house." When he had given these directions, he ran out of the back door and hid behind a barrel. A few minutes later the robbers arrived and called loudly for the shoemaker. "Alas, good gentleman, he is up in the vineyard, but I will send the dog after him at once. Here, now quickly to the vineyard, and tell your master some gentlemen are here who wish to speak to him. Go as fast as you can." And she opened the door and let the dog out. "You can really trust the dog to call your husband?" asked the robbers. "Dear me, yes. He understands everything, and will always carry any message I give him." By and by the shoemaker came in and said, "Good morning, gentlemen. The dog tells me you wish to speak to me." "Yes, we do," replied the robber. "We have come to speak to you about that guitar. It is your fault that we have murdered all our wives, and though we played as you told us, none of them ever came back to life." "You could not have played properly," said the shoemaker. "It was your own fault." "Well, we will forget all about it," answered the robbers, "if you will only sell us your dog." "Oh, that is impossible. I should never get on without him." But the robbers offered him 40 gold pieces, and at last he agreed to let them have the dog. So they departed, taking the dog with them, and when they got back to their cave, the captain declared that it was his right to have the first trial. He then called his daughter and said to her, "I am going to the inn. If anybody wants me, loose the dog and send him to call me." About an hour after someone arrived on business, the girl untied the dog and said, "Go to the inn and call my father." The dog bounded off, but ran straight to the shoemaker. When the robber got home and found no dog, he thought he must have gone back to his old master, and though night had already fallen, he went off after him. "Master Joseph, is the dog here?" asked he. "Ah, yes, the poor beast is so fond of me. You must give him time to get accustomed to new ways." So the captain brought the dog back, and the following morning handed him over to another of the band, just saying that the animal really could do what the shoemaker had said. The second robber carefully kept his own counsel, and fetched the dog secretly back from the shoemaker, and so on through the whole band. At length, when everybody had suffered, they met and told the whole story, and next day they all marched off in fury to the man who had made game of them. After reproaching him with having deceived them, they tied him up in a sack, and told him they were going to throw him into the sea. The shoemaker lay quite still, and let them do as they would. They went on till they came to a church, and the robbers said, "The sun is hot, and the sack is heavy. Let us leave it here and go in and rest." So they put the sack down by the roadside, and went into the church. Now, on a hill near by, there was a swineherd looking after a great herd of pigs, and whistling merrily. When Master Joseph heard him, he cried out as loud as he could, "I won't! I won't, I say!" "What won't you do?" asked the swineherd. "Oh," replied the shoemaker, "they want me to marry the king's daughter, and I won't do it." "How lucky you are!" sighed the swineherd. "Now, if it were only me!" "Oh, if that's all," replied the cunning shoemaker, "get you into this sack, and let me out." Then the swineherd opened the sack and took the place of the shoemaker, who went gaily off, driving the pigs before him. When the robbers were rested, they came out of the church, took up the sack, and carried it to the sea, where they threw it in, and it sank directly. As they came back, they met the shoemaker, and stared at him with open mouths. "Oh, if you only knew how many pigs live in the sea," he cried, "and the deeper you go, the more there are. I have just brought up these, and mean to return for some more." "There are still some left there?" "Oh, more than I could count," replied the shoemaker. "I will show you what you must do." Then he led the robbers back to the shore. "Now," said he, "you must each of you tie a stone to your necks, so that you may be sure to go deep enough, for I found the pigs that you saw very deep down indeed." Then the robbers all tied stones round their necks, and jumped in, and were drowned, and Master Joseph drove his pigs home, and was a rich man to the end of his days. The End.
The King Who Would Have a Beautiful Wife, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. 50 years ago there lived a king who was very anxious to get married, but as he was quite determined that his wife should be as beautiful as the sun, the thing was not so easy as it seemed, for no maiden come up to his standard. He commanded a trusty servant to search through the length and breadth of the land till he found a girl fair enough to be queen, and if he had the good luck to discover one, he was to bring her back with him. The servant set out at once on his journey. He sought high and low in castles and cottages, but though the pretty maidens were plentiful as blackberries, he felt sure that none of them would please the king. One day he had wandered far and wide, and was feeling very tired and thirsty. By the roadside stood a tiny little house, and here he knocked and asked for a cup of water. Now in this house dwelt 2 sisters, and one was 80 and the other 90 years old. They were very poor, and earned their living by spinning. This had kept their hands very soft and white, like the hands of a girl, and when the water passed through the lattice, and the servant saw the small delicate fingers, he said to himself, "A maiden must indeed be lovely if she has a hand like that," and he made haste back and told the king. "Go back at once," said his majesty, "and try to get a sight of her." The faithful servant departed on his errand without losing any time, and again he knocked at the door of the little house and begged for some water. As before, the old woman did not open the door, but passed the water through the lattice. "Do you live here alone?" asked the man. "No," replied she. "My sister lives with me. We are poor girls and have to work for our bread." "How old are you?" "I am 15, and she is 20. Then the servant went back to the king and told him all he knew, and his majesty answered, "I will have the 15-year-old one. Go and bring her here." The servant returned a third time to the little house and knocked at the door. In reply to his knock, the lattice window was pushed open, and a voice inquired what he wanted. "The king has desired me to bring back the youngest of you to become his queen," he replied. "Tell his majesty I am ready to do his bidding, but since my birth no ray of light has fallen upon my face. If it should ever do so, I shall instantly grow black. Therefore beg, I pray you, his most gracious majesty, to send this evening a shot carriage, and I will return in it to the castle." When the king heard this, he ordered his great golden carriage to be prepared, and in it to be placed some magnificent robes, and the old woman wrapped herself in a thick veil and was driven to the castle. The king was eagerly awaiting her, and when she arrived, he begged politely to raise her veil and let him see her face, but she answered, "Here the tapers are too bright and the light too strong. Would you have me turn black under your very eyes?" And the king believed her words, and the marriage took place without the veil being once lifted. Afterwards, when they were alone, he raised the corner, and knew for the first time that he had wedded a wrinkled old woman, and, in a furious burst of anger, he dashed open the window and flung her out. But, luckily for her, her clothes caught on a nail in the wall and kept her hanging between heaven and earth. While she was thus suspended, expecting every moment to be dashed to the ground, 4 fairies happened to pass by. "Look, sisters," cried one, "surely that is the old woman that the king sent for. Shall we wish her that her clothes may give way, and that she should be dashed to the ground?" "Oh, no, no, no," exclaimed another. "Let us wish her something good. I myself will wish her youth, and I beauty, and I wisdom, and I a tender heart." So spake the fairies, and went their way, leaving the most beautiful maiden in the world behind them. The next morning, when the king looked from his window, he saw this lovely creature hanging on a nail. "Ah, what have I done? Surely I must have been blind last night." And he ordered long ladders to be brought, and the maiden to be rescued, and then he fell on his knees before her, and prayed her to forgive him, and a great feast was made in her honour. Some days after came the 90-year-old sister to the palace, and asked for the queen. "Who is that hideous old witch?" said the king. "Oh, an old neighbour of mine who was half silly," she replied. But the old woman looked at her steadily, and knew her again, and said, "How have you managed to grow so young and beautiful? I should like to be young and beautiful too." This question she repeated the whole day long, till at length the queen lost patience and said, "I had my old head cut off, and this new head grew in its place." Then the old woman went to a barber and spoke to him, saying, "I will give you all you ask if you will only cut off my head, so that I may become young and lovely." "But, my good woman, if you do that, you will die." But the old woman would listen to nothing, and at last the barber took out his knife and struck the first blow at her neck. "Ah!" she shrieked, and she felt the pain. "Il faut souffrir pour être belle," said the barber, who had been in France. And at the second blow her head rolled off, and the old woman was dead for good and all. End of story.
The Princess in the Chest, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. There were once a king and a queen who lived in a beautiful castle and had a large and fair and rich and happy land to rule over. From the very first they loved each other greatly and lived very happily together, but they had no heir. They had been married for 7 years, but had neither son nor daughter, and that was a great grief to both of them. More than once it happened that when the king was in a bad temper, he let it out on the poor queen, and said that here they were now getting old, and neither they nor the kingdom had an heir, and it was all her fault. This was hard to listen to, and she went and cried and vexed herself. Finally the king said to her one day, "This can't be borne any longer. I go about childless, and it's your fault. I am going on a journey, and shall be away for a year. If you have a child when I come back again, all will be well, and I shall love you beyond all measure, and never more say an angry word to you. But if the nest is just as empty when I come home, then I must part with you." After the king had set out on his journey, the queen went about in her loneliness, and sorrowed and vexed herself more than ever. At last her maid said to her one day, "I think that some help could be found if your majesty would seek it." Then she told about a wise old woman in that country who had helped many in troubles of the same kind, and could no doubt help the queen as well, if she would send for her. The queen did so, and the wise woman came, and to her she confided her sorrow that she was childless, and the king and his kingdom had no heir. The wise woman knew help for this. "Out in the king's garden," said she, "under the great oak that stands on the left hand, just as one goes out from the castle, is a little bush, rather brown than green, with hairy leaves and long spikes. On that bush there are just at this moment 3 buds. If your majesty goes out there alone, fasting, before sunrise, and takes the middle one of the 3 buds and eats it, then in 6 months you will bring a princess into the world. As soon as she is born, she must have a nurse, whom I shall provide, and this nurse must live with the child in a secluded part of the palace. No other person must visit the child. Neither the king nor the queen must see it until it is 14 years old, for that would cause great sorrow and misfortune." The queen rewarded the old woman richly, and next morning, before the sun rose, she was down in the garden, found at once the little bush with the 3 buds, plucked the middle one and ate it. It was sweet to taste, but afterwards was as bitter as gall. 6 months after this, she brought into the world a little girl. There was a nurse in readiness, whom the wise woman had provided, and preparations were made for her living with the child, quite alone, in a secluded wing of the castle, looking out at the pleasure park. The queen did as the wise woman had told her. She gave up the child immediately, and the nurse took it and lived with it there. When the king came home and heard that a daughter had been born to him, he was of course very pleased and happy, and wanted to see her at once. The queen had then to tell him this much of the story, that it had been foretold that it would cause great sorrow and misfortune if either he or she got a sight of the child until it had completed its 14th year. This was a long time to wait. The king longed so much to get a sight of his daughter, and the queen no less than he, but she knew that it was not like other children, for it could speak immediately after it was born, and was as wise as older folk. This the nurse had told her, for with her the queen had a talk now and again, but there was no one who had ever seen the princess. The queen had also seen what the wise woman could do, so she insisted strongly that her warning should be obeyed. The king often lost his patience, and was determined to see his daughter, but the queen always put him off the idea, and so things went on until the very day before the princess completed her 14th year. The king and the queen were out in the garden then, and the king said, "Now I can't and I won't wait any longer. I must see my daughter at once. A few hours more or less can't make any difference." The queen begged him to have patience till the morning. When they had waited so long, they could surely wait a single day more, but the king was quite unreasonable. "No nonsense," said he. "She is just as much mine as yours, and I will see her." And with that he went straight up to her room. He burst the door open and pushed aside the nurse, who tried to stop him, and there he saw his daughter. She was the loveliest young princess, red and white like milk and blood, with clear blue eyes and golden hair, but right in the middle of her forehead there was a little tuft of brown hair. The princess went to meet her father, fell on his neck and kissed him, but with that she said, "Oh, father, father, what have you done now? Tomorrow I must die, and you must choose one of 3 things. Either the land must be smitten with the black pestilence, or you must have a long and bloody war, or you must, as soon as I am dead, lay me in a plain wooden chest and set it in the church, and for a whole year place a sentinel beside it every night." The king was frightened indeed, and thought she was raving, but in order to please her he said, "Well, of these 3 things I shall choose the last. If you die, I shall lay you at once in a plain wooden chest, and have it set in the church, and every night I shall place a sentinel beside it, but you shall not die, even if you are ill now." He immediately summoned all the best doctors in the country, and they came with all their prescriptions and their medicine bottles, but next day the princess was stiff and cold in death. All the doctors could certify to that, and they all put their names to this, and appended their seals, and then they had done all they could. The king kept his promise. The princess's body was laid the same day in a plain wooden chest, and set in the chapel of the castle, and on that night and every night after it, a sentinel was posted in the church to keep watch over the chest. The first morning, when they came to let the sentinel out, there was no sentinel there. They thought he had just got frightened and run away, and next evening a new one was posted in the church. In the morning he was also gone. So it went every night. When they came in the morning to let the sentinel out, there was no one there, and it was impossible to discover which way he had gone if he had run away. And what should they run away for, every one of them, so that nothing more was overheard or seen of them from the hour that they were set on guard beside the princess's chest? It became now a general belief that the princess's ghost walked and ate up all those who were to guard her chest, and very soon there was no one left who would be placed on this duty, and the king's soldiers deserted the service before their turn came to be her bodyguard. The king then promised a large reward to the soldier who would volunteer for the post. This did for some time, as there were found a few reckless fellows who wished to earn this good payment, but they never got it, for in the morning they too had disappeared like the rest. So it had gone on for something like a whole year. Every night a sentinel had been placed beside the chest, either by compulsion or of his own free will, but not a single one of the sentinels was to be seen either on the following day or any time thereafter. And so it had also gone with one on the night before a certain day, when a merry young smith came wandering to the town where the king's castle stood. It was the capital of the country, and people of every king came to it to get work. This smith, whose name was Christian, had come for that same purpose. There was no work for him in the place he belonged to, and he wanted now to seek a place in the capital. There he entered an inn, where he sat down in the public room and got something to eat. Some under-officers were sitting there, who were out to try to get someone enlisted to stand sentry. They had to go in this way day after day, and hitherto they had always succeeded in finding one or other reckless fellow. But on this day they had as yet found no one. It was too well known how all the sentinels disappeared who were set on that post, and all that they had got hold of had refused with thanks. These sat down beside Christian, and ordered drinks, and drank along with him. Now Christian was a merry fellow who liked good company. He could both drink and sing, and talk and boast as well, when he got a little drop in his head. He told these under-officers that he was one of that kind of folk who never are afraid of anything. Then he was just the kind of man they liked, said they, and he might easily earn a good penny before he was a day older, for the king paid $100 to anyone who would stand as sentinel in the church all night beside his daughter's chest. Christian was not afraid of that. He wasn't afraid of anything. So they drank another bottle of wine on this, and Christian went with them up to the colonel, where he was put into uniform with musket and all the rest, and was then shut up in the church to stand as sentinel that night. It was 8 o'clock when he took up his post, and for the first hour he was quite proud of his courage. During the second hour he was well pleased with the large reward that he would get. But in the third hour, when it was getting near 11, the effects of the wine passed off, and he began to get uncomfortable, for he had heard about this post, that no one had ever escaped alive from it, so far as was known. But neither did anyone know what had become of all the sentinels. The thought of this ran in his head so much after the wine was out of it that he searched about everywhere for a way of escape, and finally at 11 o'clock he found a little postern in the steeple which was not locked, and out at this he crept, intending to run away. At the same moment as he put his foot outside the church door, he saw standing before him a little man, who said, "Good evening, Christian. Where are you going?" With that he felt as if he were rooted to the spot and could not move. "Nowhere," said he. "Oh, yes," said the little man, "you were just about to run away, but you have taken upon you to stand sentinel in the church tonight, and there you must stay." Christian said very humbly that he dared not, and therefore wanted to get away, and begged to be let go. "No," said the little one, "you must remain at your post, but I shall give you a piece of good advice. You shall go up into the pulpit and remain standing there. You need never mind what you see or hear. It will not be able to do you any harm if you remain in your place until you hear the lid of the chest slam down again behind the dead. Then all danger is past, and you can go about the church wherever you please." The little man then pushed him in at the door again and locked it after him. Christian made haste to get up into the pulpit and stood there without noticing anything until the clock struck 12. Then the lid of the princess's chest sprang up, and out of it there came something like the princess, dressed as you see in the picture. It shrieked and howled, "Sentry, where are you? Sentry, where are you? If you don't come, you shall get the most cruel death anyone had ever got." It went all round the church, and when it finally caught sight of the smith up in the pulpit, it came rushing thither and mounted the steps. But it could not get up the whole way, and for all that it stretched and strained, it could not touch Christian, who meanwhile stood and trembled up in the pulpit. When the clock struck 1, the appearance had to go back into the chest again, and Christian heard the lid slam after it. After this there was dead silence in the church. He lay down where he was and fell asleep, and did not awake before it was bright daylight, and he heard steps outside, and the noise of the key being put into the lock. Then he came down from the pulpit, and stood with his musket in front of the princess's chest. It was the colonel himself who came with the patrol, and he was not a little surprised when he found the recruit safe and sound. He wanted to have a report, but Christian would give him none. So he took him straight up to the king, and announced for the first time that here was the sentinel who had stood guard in the church overnight. The king immediately got out of bed and laid the $100 for him on the table, and then wanted to question him. "Have you seen anything?" said he. "Have you seen my daughter?" "I have stood at my post," said the young smith, "and that is quite enough. I undertook nothing more." He was not sure whether he dared tell what he had seen and heard, and besides, he was also a little conceited because he had done what no other man had been able to do, or had had courage for. The king professed to be quite satisfied, and asked him whether he would engage himself to stand on guard again the following night. "No, thank you," said Christian. "I will have no more of that." "As you please," said the king. "You have behaved like a brave fellow, and now you shall have your breakfast. You must be needing something to strengthen you after that turn." The king had breakfast laid for him, and sat down at the table with him in person. He kept constantly filling his glass for him, and praising him, and drinking his health. Christian needed no pressing, but did full justice both to the food and drink, and not least to the latter. Finally he grew bold, and said that if the king would give him $200 for it, he was his man to stand sentry next night as well. When this was arranged, Christian bade him good day, and went down among the guards, and then out into the town along with other soldiers and under-officers. He had his pocket full of money, and treated them, and drank with them, and boasted and made game of the good-for-nothings who were afraid to stand on guard, because they were frightened that the dead princess would eat them. See whether she had eaten him. So the day passed in mirth and glee, but when 8 o'clock came, Christian was again shut up in the church, all alone. Before he had been there 2 hours, he got tired of it, and thought only of getting away. He found a little door behind the altar, which was not locked, and at 10 o'clock he slipped out at it, and took to his heels, and made for the beach. He had got halfway thither, when all at once the same little man stood in front of him and said, "Good evening, Christian. Where are you going?" "I've leave to go where I please," said the smith, but at the same time he noticed that he could not move a foot. "No, you have undertaken to keep guard tonight as well," said the little man, "and you must attend to that." He then took hold of him, and however unwilling he was, Christian had to go with him right back to the same little door that he had crept out at. When they got there, the little man said to him, "Go in front of the altar now, and take in your hand the book that is lying there. There you shall stay till you hear the lid of the chest slammed down over the dead. In that way you will come to no harm." With that, the little man shoved him in at the door and locked it. Christian then immediately went in front of the altar and took the book in his hand, and stood thus until the clock struck 12, and the appearance sprang out of the chest. "Sentry, where are you? Sentry, where are you?" it shrieked, and then rushed to the pulpit and right up into it. But there was no one there that night. Then it howled and shrieked again. "My father has sent no sentry in. War and pest this night begin." At the same moment it noticed the smith standing in front of the altar, and came rushing towards him. "Are you there?" it screamed. "Now I'll catch you." But it could not come up over the step in front of the altar, and there it continued to howl and scream and threaten until the clock struck 1, when it had to go into the chest again, and Christian heard the lid slam above it. That night, however, it had not the same appearance as on the previous one. It was less ugly. When all was quiet in the church, the smith lay down before the altar and slept calmly till the following morning, when the colonel came to fetch him. He was taken up to the king again, and things went on as the day before. He got his money, but would give no explanation whether he had seen the king's daughter, and he would not take the post again, he said. But after he had got a good breakfast, and tasted well of the king's wines, he undertook to go on guard again the 3rd night, but he would not do it for less than half of the kingdom, he said. For it was a dangerous post, and the king had to agree, and promise him this. The remainder of the day went like the previous one. He played the boastful soldier and the merry smith, and he had comrades and boon companions in plenty. At 8 o'clock he had to put on his uniform again, and was shut up in the church. He had not been there for an hour before he had come to his senses, and thought, "It's best to stop now while the game is going well." The 3rd night he was sure would be the worst. He had been drunk when he promised it, and the half of the kingdom, the king could never have been in earnest about that. So he decided to leave, without waiting so long as on the previous nights. In that way he would escape the little man who had watched him before. All the doors and posterns were locked, but he finally thought of creeping up to a window and opening that, and as the clock struck 9 he crept out there. It was fairly high in the wall, but he got to the ground with no bones broken and started to run. He got down to the shore without meeting anyone, and there he got into a boat and pushed off from land. He laughed immensely to himself at the thought of how cleverly he had managed and how he had cheated the little man. Just then he heard a voice from the shore. "Good evening, Christian. Where are you going?" He gave no answer. "Tonight your legs will be too short," he thought, and pulled at the oars. But he then felt something lay hold of the boat and drag it straight into shore, for all that he sat and struggled with the oars. The man then laid hold of him and said, "You must remain at your post as you have promised." And whether he liked it or not, Christian had just to go back with him the whole way to the church. He could never get in at that window again. Christian said it was far too high up. "You must go in there, and you shall go in there," said the little man, and with that he lifted him up on to the window-sill. Then he said to him, "Notice well now what you have to do. This evening you must stretch yourself out on the left-hand side of her chest. The lid opens to the right, and she comes out to the left. When she has got out of the chest and passed over you, you must get into it and lie there, and that in a hurry, without her seeing you. There you must remain lying until day dawns, and whether she threatens you or entreats you, you must not come out of it or give her any answer. Then she has no power over you, and both you and she are freed." The smith then had to go in at the window, just as he came out, and went and laid himself all his length on the left side of the princess's chest, close up to it, and there he lay stiff as a rock until the clock struck 12. Then the lid sprang up to the right, and the princess came out straight over him, and rushed round the church, howling and shrieking, "Sentry, where are you? Sentry, where are you?" She went towards the altar, and right up to it, but there was no one there. Then she screamed again, "My father has set no sentry in. War and pest will now begin." Then she went round the whole church, both up and down, sighing and weeping, "My father has set no sentry in. War and pest will now begin." Then she went away again, and at the same moment the clock in the tower struck 1. Then the smith heard in the church a soft music, which grew louder and louder, and soon filled the whole building. He heard also a multitude of footsteps, as if the church was being filled with people. He heard the priest go through the service in front of the altar, and there was singing more beautiful than he had ever heard before. Then he also heard the priest offer up a prayer of thanksgiving because the land had been freed from war and pestilence, and from all misfortune, and the king's daughter delivered from the evil one. Many voices joined in, and a hymn of praise was sung. Then he heard the priest again, and heard his own name and that of the princess, and thought that he was being wedded to her. The church was packed full, but he could see nothing. Then he heard again the many footsteps as old folk leaving the church, while the music sounded fainter and fainter until it altogether died away. When it was silent, the light of day began to break in through the windows. The smith sprang up out of the chest and fell on his knees and thanked God. The church was empty, but up in front of the altar lay the princess, white and red like a human being, but sobbing and crying and shaking with cold in her white shroud. The smith took his sentry coat and wrapped it round her. Then she dried her tears, and took his hand and thanked him, and said that he had now freed her from all the sorcery that had been in her from her birth, and which had come over her again when her father broke the command against seeing her until she had completed her 14th year. She said further that if he who had delivered her would take her in marriage, she would be his. If not, she would go into a nunnery, and he could marry no other as long as she lived, for he was wedded to her with the service of the dead, which he had heard. She was now the most beautiful young princess that anyone could wish to see, and he was now lord of half the kingdom, which had been promised him for standing on guard the third nigh. So they agreed that they would have each other and love each other all their days. With the first sunbeam the watch came and opened the church, and not only was the colonel there, but the king in person, come to see what had happened to the sentinel. He found them both sitting hand in hand on the step in front of the altar, and immediately knew his daughter again, and took her in his arms, thanking God and her deliverer. He made no objections to what they had arranged, and so Christian the smith held his wedding with the princess, and got half the kingdom at once, and the whole of it when the king died. As for the other sentries, with so many doors and windows open, no doubt they had run away and gone into the Prussian service. And as for what Christian said he saw, He had been drinking more wine than was good for him. The End. The Snowman, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. "How astonishingly cold it is! My body is cracking all over," said the Snowman. "The wind is really cutting one's very life out, and how that fiery thing up there glares!" He meant the sun, which was just setting. "It shan't make me blink, though, and I shall keep quite cool and collected." Instead of eyes, he had 2 large 3-cornered pieces of slate in his head. His mouth consisted of an old rake, so that he had teeth as well. He was born amidst the shouts and laughter of the boys, and created by the jingle bells and cracking whips of the sledges. The sun went down, the full moon rose, large, round, clear, and beautiful, in the dark blue sky. "There it is again on the other side," said the Snowman, by which he meant the sun was appearing again. "I have become quite accustomed to its glaring. I hope it will hang there and shine, so that I may be able to see myself. I wish I knew, though, how one ought to see about changing one's position. I should very much like to move about. If I only could, I would glide up and down the ice there, as I saw the boys doing, but somehow or other I don't know how to run." "Bow wow!" barked the old yard dog. He was rather hoarse, and couldn't bark very well. His hoarseness came on when he was a house dog, and used to lie in front of the stove. "The sun will soon teach you to run. I saw that last winter with your predecessor, and farther back still with his predecessors. They have all run away." "I don't understand you, my friend," said the Snowman. "That thing up there is to teach me to run?" He meant the moon. "Well, it certainly did run just now, for I saw it quite plainly over there, and now here it is on this side." "You know nothing at all about it," said the yard dog. "Why, you have only just been made. The thing you see there is the moon. The other thing you saw going down the other side was the sun. He will come up again tomorrow morning, and will soon teach you how to run away down the gutter. The weather is going to change. I feel it already by the pain in my left hind leg. The weather is certainly going to change." "I can't understand him," said the Snowman, "but I have an idea that he is speaking of something unpleasant. That thing that glares so, and then disappears, the sun, as he calls it, is not my friend. I know that by instinct." "Bow wow!" barked the yard dog, and walked 3 times round himself, and then crept into his kennel to sleep. The weather really did change. Towards morning a dense, damp fog lay over the whole neighborhood. Later on came an icy wind, which sent the frost packing. But when the sun rose, it was a glorious sight. The trees and shrubs were covered with rime, and looked like a wood of coral, and every branch was thick with long white blossoms. The most delicate twigs, which are lost among the foliage in summer-time, came now into prominence, and it was like a spider's web of glistening white. The lady birches waved in the wind, and when the sun shone, everything glittered and sparkled as if it were sprinkled with diamond dust, and great diamonds were lying on the snowy carpet. "Isn't it wonderful?" exclaimed a girl who was walking with a young man in the garden. They stopped near the Snowman and looked at the glistening trees. "Summer cannot show a more beautiful sight," she said, with her eyes shining. "And one can't get a fellow like this in summer either," said the young man, pointing to the Snowman. "He's a beauty." The girl laughed and nodded to the Snowman, and then they both danced away over the snow. "Who were those 2?" asked the Snowman of the yard dog. "You have been in this yard longer than I have. Do you know who they are?" "Do I know them indeed?" answered the yard dog. "She has often stroked me, and he has given me bones. I don't bite either of them." "But what are they?" asked the Snowman. "Lovers," replied the yard dog. "They will go into one kennel and gnaw the same bone." "Are they the same kind of beings that we are?" asked the Snowman. "They are our masters," answered the yard dog. "Really, people who have only been in the world one day know very little." That's the conclusion I have come to. Now I have age and wisdom. I know everyone in the house, and I can remember a time when I was not lying here in a cold kennel. Bow, wow! The cold is splendid, said the snowman. Tell me some more, but don't rattle your chain so, it makes me crack. Bow, wow, barked the yard dog. They used to say I was a pretty little fellow. Then I lay in a velvet-covered chair in my master's house. My mistress used to nurse me and kiss and fondle me and call me her dear, sweet little Alice. But by and by I grew too big, and I was given to the housekeeper, and I went into the kitchen. You can see into it from where you are standing. You can look at the room in which I was master, for so I was when I was with the housekeeper. Of course, it was a smaller place than upstairs, but it was more comfortable, for I wasn't chased about and teased by the children as I had been before. My food was just as good, or even better. I had my own pillow, and there was a stove there, which at this time of year is the most beautiful thing in the world. I used to creep right under that stove. Ah, me, I often dream of that stove still. Wow, wow! Is a stove so beautiful? Asked the snowman. Is it anything like me? It is just the opposite of you. It is coal-black and has a long neck with a brass pipe. It eats firewood so that fire spouts out of its mouth. One has to keep close beside it. Quite underneath is the nicest of all. You can see it through the window from where you are standing. And the snowman looked in that direction and saw a smooth, polished object with a brass pipe. The flicker from the fire reached him across the snow. The snowman felt wonderfully happy, and a feeling came over him which he could not express, but all those who are not snowmen know about it. "Why did you leave her?" asked the snowman. He had a feeling that such a being must be a lady. "How could you leave such a place?" "I had to," said the yard dog. "They turned me out of doors and chained me up here. I had bitten the youngest boy in the leg because he took away the bone I was gnawing. A bone for a bone, I thought. But they were very angry, and from that time I have been chained here, and I have lost my voice. Don't you hear how hoarse I am? Bow wow! I can't speak like other dogs. Bow wow! That was the end of happiness." The snowman, however, was not listening to him any more. He was looking into the room where the housekeeper lived, where the stove stood on its 4 iron legs, and seemed to be just the same size as the snowman. "How something is cracking inside me," he said. "Shall I never be able to get in there? It is certainly a very innocent wish, and our innocent wishes ought to be fulfilled. I must get there and lean against the stove, if I have to break the window first." "You will never get inside there," said the yard dog, "and if you were to reach the stove, you would disappear. Bow wow!" "I'm as good as gone already," answered the snowman. "I believe I'm breaking up." The whole day the snowman looked through the window. Towards dusk the room grew still more inviting. The stove gave out a mild light, not at all like the moon or even the sun. No, as only a stove can shine when it has something to feed upon. When the door of the room was open, it flared up. This was one of its peculiarities. It flickered quite red upon the snowman's white face. "I can't stand it any longer," he said. "How beautiful it looks, with its tongue stretched out like that." It was a long night, but the snowman did not find it so. There he stood, wrapped in his pleasant thoughts, and they froze so that he cracked. Next morning the panes of the kitchen window were covered with ice, and the most beautiful ice flowers that even a snowman could desire, only they blotted out the stove. The window would not open. He couldn't see the stove, which he thought was such a lovely lady. There was a cracking and cracking inside him and all around. There was just such a frost as a snowman would delight in. But this snowman was different. How could he feel happy? "Yours is a bad illness for a snowman," said the yard dog. "I also suffered from it, but I have got over it. Bow wow!" he barked. "The weather is going to change," he added. The weather did change. There came a thaw. When this set in, the snowman set off. He did not say anything, and he did not complain, and those are bad signs. One morning he broke up altogether, and lo, where he had stood, there remained a broomstick standing upright, round which the boys had built him. "Ah, now I understand why he loved the stove," said the yard dog. "That is the raker they used to clean out the stove. The snowman had a stove raker in his body. That's what was the matter with him, and now it's all over with him. Bow wow!" And before long it was all over with the winter too. "Bow wow!" barked the hoarse yard dog. But the young girls sang, "Woods, your bright green garments don, willows, your woolly gloves put on. Lark and cuckoo daily sing, February has brought the spring. My heart joins in your song so sweet, Come out, dear sun, the world to greet." And no one thought of the snowman. Snowflake, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time there lived a peasant called Ivan, and he had a wife whose name was Marie. They would have been quite happy except for one thing. They had no children to play with, and as they were now old people, they did not find that watching the children of their neighbors at all made up to them for having one of their own. One winter, which nobody living will ever forget, the snow lay so deep that it came up to the knees of even the tallest man. When it had all fallen and the sun was shining again, the children ran out into the street to play, and the old man and his wife sat at their window and gazed at them. The children first made a sort of little terrace and stamped it hard and firm, and then they began to make a snow woman. Ivan and Marie watched them, the while thinking about many things. Suddenly Ivan's face brightened, and looking at his wife, he said, "Wife, why shouldn't we make a snow woman too?" "Why not?" replied Marie, who happened to be in a very good temper. "It might amuse us a little. But there is no use making a woman. Let us make a little snow child, and pretend it is a living one." "Yes, let us do that," said Ivan, and he took down his cap and went into the garden with his old wife. Then the two set to work with all their might to make a doll out of the snow. They shaped a little body and 2 little hands and 2 little feet. On top of all they placed a ball of snow, out of which the head was to be. "What in the world are you doing?" asked a passer-by. "Can't you guess?" returned Ivan. "Making a snow child," replied Marie. They had finished the nose and the chin. 2 holes were left for the eyes, and Ivan carefully shaped out the mouth. No sooner had he done so than he felt a warm breath upon his cheek. He started back in surprise and looked, and behold, the eyes of the child met his, and its lips, which were as red as raspberries, smiled at him. "What is it?" cried Ivan, crossing himself. "Am I mad, or is the thing bewitched?" The snow child bent its head as if it had been really alive. It moved its little arms and its little legs in the snow that lay about it, just as the living children did theirs. "Ah, Ivan! Ivan!" exclaimed Marie, trembling with joy. "Heaven has sent us a child at last!" And she threw herself upon Snowflake, for that was the snow child's name, and covered her with kisses. And the loose snow fell away from Snowflake as an eggshell does from an egg, and it was a little girl whom Marie held in her arms. "Oh, my darling Snowflake!" cried the old woman, and led her into the cottage. And Snowflake grew fast. Each hour as well as each day made a difference, and every day she became more and more beautiful. The old couple hardly knew how to contain themselves for joy, and thought of nothing else. The cottage was always full of village children, for they amused Snowflake, and there was nothing in the world they would not have done to amuse her. She was their doll, and they were continually inventing new dresses for her, and teaching her songs or playing with her. Nobody knew how clever she was. She noticed everything, and could learn a lesson in a moment. Anyone would have taken her for 13 at least, and besides all that, she was so good and obedient and pretty too. Her skin was as white as snow, her eyes as blue as forget-me-nots, and her hair was long and golden. Only her cheeks had no color in them, but were as fair as her forehead. So the winter went on, till at last the spring sun mounted higher in the heavens and began to warm the earth. The grass grew green in the fields, and high in the air the larks were heard singing. The village girls met and danced in a ring, singing, "Beautiful spring, how came you here? How came you here? Did you come on a plough, or was it a harrow?" Only Snowflake sat quite still by the window of the cottage. "What is the matter, dear child?" asked Marie. "Why are you so sad? Are you ill? Or have they treated you unkindly?" "No," replied Snowflake. "It is nothing, mother. No one has hurt me. I am well." The spring sun had chased away the last snow from its hiding place under the hedges. The fields were full of flowers. Nightingales sang in the trees, and all the world was gay. But the gayer grew the birds and the flowers, the sadder became Snowflake. She hid herself from her playmates, and curled herself up where the shadows were deepest, like a lily amongst its leaves. Her only pleasure was to lie amid the green willows near some sparkling stream. At the dawn and at twilight only she seemed happy. When a great storm broke and the earth was white with hail, she became bright and joyous as the snowflake of old. But when the clouds passed and the hail melted beneath the snow, Snowflake would burst into tears and weep as a sister would weep over her brother. The spring passed, and it was the eve of St. John, or Midsummer Day. This was the greatest holiday of the year, when the young girls met in the woods to dance and play. They went to fetch Snowflake, and said to Marie, "Let her come and dance with us." But Marie was afraid. She could not tell why, only she could not bear the child to go. Snowflake did not wish to go either, but they had no excuse ready. So Marie kissed the girl and said, "Go, my Snowflake, and be happy with your friends. And you, dear children, be careful of her. You know she is the light of my eyes to me." "Oh, we will take care of her," cried the girls gaily, and they ran off to the woods. There they wore wreaths, gathered nosegays, and sang songs, some sad, some merry, and whatever they did, Snowflake did too. When the sun set, they lit a fire of dry grass and placed themselves in a row, Snowflake being the last of all. "Now watch us," they said, "and run just as we do." And they all began to sing and to jump one after another across the fire. Suddenly, close behind them, they heard a sigh, then a groan. "Ah!" They turned hastily and looked at each other. There was nothing. They looked again. Where was Snowflake? She has hidden herself for fun, they thought, and searched for her everywhere. "Snowflake! Snowflake!" But there was no answer. Where can she be? Oh, she must have gone home. They returned to the village, but there was no Snowflake. For days after that they sought her high and low. They examined every bush and every hedge, but there was no Snowflake. And long after everyone else had given up hope, Ivan and Marie would wander through the woods crying, "Snowflake, my dove, come back, come back." And sometimes they thought they heard a call, but it was never the voice of Snowflake. And what had become of her? Had a fierce wild beast seized her and dragged her into his lair in the forest? Had some bird carried her off across the wild blue sea? No, no beast had touched her, no bird had borne her away. With the first breath of flame that swept over her when she ran with her friends, Snowflake had melted away, and a little soft haze floating upwards was all that remained of her. The End.
The Water of Life, from the Pink Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. 3 brothers and 1 sister lived together in a small cottage, and they loved one another dearly. One day the eldest brother, who had never done anything but amuse himself from sunrise to sunset, said to the rest, "Let us all work hard, and perhaps we shall grow rich and be able to build ourselves a palace." And his brothers and sister answered joyfully, "Yes, we will all work." So they fell to working with all their might, till at last they became rich and were able to build themselves a beautiful palace, and everyone came from miles round to see its wonders and to say how splendid it was. No one thought of finding any faults, till at length an old woman, who had been walking through the rooms with a crowd of people, suddenly exclaimed, "Yes, it is a splendid palace, but there is still something it needs." "And what may that be?" "A church." When they heard this, the brothers set to work again to earn some money, and when they had got enough, they set about building a church, which should be as large and beautiful as the palace itself. And after the church was finished, greater numbers of people than ever flocked to see the palace and the church, and vast gardens and magnificent halls. But one day, as the brothers were as usual doing the honors to their guests, an old man turned to them and said, "Yes, it is all most beautiful, but there is still something it needs." "And what may that be?" "A pitcher of the water of life, a branch of the tree, the smell of whose flowers gives eternal beauty, and the talking bird." "And where am I to find all those?" "Go to the mountain that is far off yonder, and you will find what you seek." After the old man had bowed politely and taken farewell of them, the eldest brother said to the rest, "I will go in search of the water of life and the talking bird and the tree of beauty." "But suppose some evil thing befalls you," asked his sister, "how shall we know?" "You are right," he replied. "I had not thought of that." Then they followed the old man and said to him, "My eldest brother wishes to seek for the water of life and the tree of beauty and the talking bird that you tell him are needful to make our place perfect. But how shall we know if any evil thing befall him?" So the old man took them a knife and gave it to them, saying, "Keep this carefully, and as long as the blade is bright, all is well. But if the blade is bloody, then know that evil has befallen him." The brothers thanked him and departed, and went straight to the palace, where they found the young man making ready to set out for the mountain where the treasures he longed for lay hid. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked, till he had gone a great way, and there he met a giant. "Can you tell me how much further I have still to go before I reach that mountain yonder?" "And why do you wish to go there?" "I am seeking the water of life, the talking bird, and the branch of the tree of beauty." "Many have passed by seeking those treasures, but none have ever come back, and you will never come back either unless you mark my words. Follow this path, and when you reach the mountain, you will find it covered with stones. Do not stop to look at them, but keep on your way. As you go, you will hear scoffs and laughs behind you. It will be the stones that mock. Do not heed them. Above all, do not turn round. If you do, you will become as one of them. Walk straight on till you get to the top, and then take all you wish for." The young man thanked him for his counsel, and walked, and walked, and walked, till he reached the mountain. And as he climbed, he heard behind him scoffs and jeers, but he kept his ears steadily closed to them. At last the noise grew so loud that he lost patience, and he stooped to pick up a stone to hurl into the midst of the clamor, when suddenly his arms seemed to stiffen, and the next moment he was a stone himself. That day his sister, who thought her brother's steps were long in returning, took out the knife, and found the blade was red as blood. Then she cried out to her brothers that something terrible had come to pass. "I will go and find him," said the second, and he went. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked, till he met the giant, and asked him if he had seen a young man traveling towards the mountain. And the giant answered, "Yes, I have seen him pass, but I have not seen him come back. The spell must have worked upon him." "Then what can I do to disenchant him and find the water of life, the talking bird, and a branch of the tree of beauty?" "Follow this path, and when you reach the mountain you will find it covered with stones. Do not stop to look at them, but climb steadily on. Above all, heed not the laughs and scoffs that will arise on all sides, and never turn round. And when you reach the top, you can then take all you desire." The young man thanked him for his counsel and set out for the mountain. But no sooner did he reach it than loud jests and jibes broke out on every side, and almost deafened him. For some time he let them rail, and pushed boldly on, till he had passed the place which his brother had gained. Then suddenly he thought that among the scoffing sounds he heard his brother's voice. He stopped and looked back, and another stone was added to the number. Meanwhile The sister left at home was counting the days when her two brothers should return to her. The time seemed long, and it would be hard to say how often she took out the knife and looked at its polished blade to make sure that this one at least was still safe. The blade was always bright and clear. Each time she looked, she had the happiness of knowing that all was well, till one evening, tired and anxious as she frequently was at the end of the day, she took it from its drawer, and behold, the blade was red with blood. Her cry of horror brought her youngest brother to her, and unable to speak, she held out the knife. "I will go," he said. So he walked, and he walked, and he walked, until he met the giant, and he asked, "Have two young men making for yonder mountain passed this way?" And the giant answered, "Yes, they have passed by, but they never came back, and by this I know that the spell has fallen upon them." "Then what must I do to free them, and to get the water of life and the talking bird and the branch of the tree of beauty?" "Go to the mountain, which you will find so thickly covered with stones that you will hardly be able to place your feet, and walk straight forward, turning neither to the right hand nor to the left, and paying no heed to the laughs and scoffs which will follow you till you reach the top, and then you may take all that you desire." The young man thanked the giant for his counsel, and set forth to the mountain. And when he began to climb, there burst forth all around him a storm of scoffs and jeers. But he thought of the giant's words, and looked neither to the right hand nor to the left, till the mountain top lay straight before him. A moment now, and he would have gained it, when through the groans and yells he heard his brothers' voices. He turned, and there was one stone the more. And all this while his sister was pacing up and down the palace, hardly letting the knife out of her hand, and dreading what she knew she would see, and what she did see. The blade grew red before her eyes, and she said, "Now it is my turn." So she walked, and she walked, and she walked, till she came to the giant, and prayed him to tell her if he had seen three young men pass that way seeking the distant mountain. "I have seen them pass, but they have never returned, and by this I know that the spell has fallen upon them." "And what must I do to set them free, and to find the water of life, and the talking bird, and a branch of the tree of beauty?" "You must go to that mountain, which is so full of stones that your feet will hardly find a place to tread. And as you climb, you will hear a noise as if all the stones in the world were mocking you, but pay no heed to anything you may hear, and once you gain the top, you have gained everything." The girl thanked him for his counsel, and set out for the mountain, and scarcely had she gone a few steps upward, when cries and screams broke forth round her, and she felt as if each stone she trod on was a living thing. But she remembered the words of the giant, and knew not what had befallen her brothers, and kept her face steadily towards the mountain top, which grew nearer and nearer every moment. But as she mounted, the clamour increased sevenfold. High above them all rang the voices of her three brothers. But the girl took no heed, and at last her feet stood upon the top. Then she looked round, and saw, lying in a hollow, the pool of the water of life. And she took the brazen pitcher that she had brought with her, and filled it to the brim. By the side of the pool stood the tree of beauty with the talking bird on one of its boughs, and she caught the bird and placed it in a cage, and broke off one of the branches. After that she turned and went joyfully down the hill again, carrying her treasures, but her long climb had tired her out, and the brazen pitcher was very heavy, and as she walked, a few drops of the water spilt on the stones, and as it touched them, they changed into young men and maidens, crowding about her to give thanks for their deliverance. So she learnt by this how the evil spell might be broken, and she carefully sprinkled every stone till there was not one left, only a great company of youths and girls who followed her down the mountain. When they arrived at the palace, she did not lose a moment in planting the branch of the tree of beauty and watering it with the water of life, and the branch shot up into a tree and was heavy with flowers, and the talking bird nestled in its branches. Now the fame of these wonders was noised abroad, and the people flocked in great numbers to see the three marvels and the maiden who had won them. And among the sightseers came the king's son, who would not go till everything was shown him, and till he had heard how it had all happened. And the prince admired the strangeness and beauty of the treasures in the palace, but more than all, he admired the beauty and courage of the maiden who had brought them there. So he went home and told his parents, and gained their consent to wed her for his wife. Then the marriage was celebrated in the church adjoining the palace. Then the bridegroom took her to his home, where they lived happily ever after. The end of The Water of Life.